It began with men who willingly stepped into the sky, not because they loved danger, not because they wanted glory, but because something inside them refused the idea of fighting a war with their feet on the ground. The 101st Airborne Division was born from the wild belief that you could drop an entire army from the heavens, scatter them behind enemy lines, and still expect them to fight like giants when their boots finally hit the earth. And somehow, impossibly, it worked because the men who wore the Screaming Eagle patch were not built like anyone else. They trained until their bodies cramped, until their lungs ached, until their world shrank to the rhythm of running, climbing, falling, and getting back up again. They jumped from towers to learn fear. They jumped from platforms to learn trust. And finally, they jumped from aircraft roaring through open sky to learn the truth, that being airborne meant surrendering everything except courage. In the air, there were no trenches to hide in, no walls to break the wind, no familiar ground to cling to. Only darkness, the ripping howl of engines, and the long, breathless moment before the jump light turned green. When they stepped out, they fell through night like whispers dropped from the stars, drifting toward foreign fields, gunfire cracking below them, tracers reaching upward like claws trying to tear them from the sky. Some landed alone. Some landed wounded. Some landed far from where anyone expected them to be. But when their boots touched soil, they didn't look for help. They looked for the mission. And they made chaos their home. That was the 101st. In Normandy, they landed in fields flooded with water and fear. They fought in orchards, lanes, and hedgerows where each shadow hid a new threat. They gathered into small bands, not because they were ordered to, but because instinct pulled them together. They secured bridges before dawn. They cut roads the enemy desperately needed. They held villages no one expected them to reach. They were the first Americans to touch French soil on D-Day, and the last to leave the fight behind them. In Holland, they drifted down into sunlight, golden fields, red rooftops, cheering civilians, yet even beauty carried danger. As part of Market Garden, they seized roads under fire, held them against armoured attacks, and pushed deeper until the line buckled under forces too heavy to stop. They endured the cold rains of autumn while tanks thundered past. They learned what it meant to advance without retreat as an option. And then came the winter, the one that nearly shattered the world. In the forests around Bastogne, surrounded, freezing, starving, low on ammunition, they dug foxholes into frozen earth, so solid it cracked their tools. Snow fell endlessly. Trees exploded from artillery. Each breath felt like a blade in the lungs. Yet they stayed, they held, they refused surrender. The world remembers that moment because it revealed something the division's training could never teach, the difference between tough men and unbreakable ones. Tonight, we return to the stories that made the 101st more than a division stories that turned them into legend. The jumps, the marches, the losses, the victories. The men who stepped into darkness again and again, trusting silk, instinct, and each other more than any map or plan ever drawn. Before we move deeper into their journey, I want to ask you something quietly, in your own words. Where are you listening from tonight, and what kind of place surrounds you? Soft, dim, silent, or full of small noises that make the night feel alive? And something deeper, something emotional. When you think of courage, not in war, but in life, is there someone you admire for the way they stood firm during a difficult moment? Someone whose strength you carry with you. You can share their name if it feels right. And one more invitation, unique to this story. Think of a moment in your own life when you had to leap into something without knowing how you would land. A decision, a change, a risk. If you want, tell me what pushed you to make that jump, not the fear, but the reason you stepped forward anyway. And if these long, gentle journeys through history help you relax, breathe easier, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. August 16th, 1942. Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The thermometer climbs past 90 degrees before noon, heat shimmering off the parade ground where 5,000 men stand in formation. Major General William C. Lee steps to the podium, his uniform already dark with sweat, and looks across faces that belong to volunteers who have no idea what they've signed up for. These men have passed physical tests that eliminated 40% of applicants. They've endured weeks of runs, jumps, and evaluations designed to break the weak. Now they're about to become something that doesn't yet exist in the American military, an Airborne Division. Lee's voice carries across the silence. The 501st has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. The words sound grandiose, almost ridiculous in the Louisiana heat. Within 2 years, those words will be carved into memory by blood and sacrifice across Europe. But on this August afternoon, they're just a promise made by a visionary to men who don't yet know if parachuting into combat is genius or suicide. The idea of airborne warfare was barely a decade old, born from experiments that military conservatives viewed with deep skepticism. The Soviet Union had demonstrated mass parachute drops in the 1930s, and Germany had shocked the world with airborne assaults on Belgium and Crete in 1941. But American military leadership remained divided. Paratroopers were expensive to train, required specialized aircraft, and the mortality rate during practice jumps was alarming. 23 men had already died in training accidents before the 101st was even activated. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, had championed the airborne concept over fierce opposition from officers who believed it was a waste of resources. Marshall argued that modern warfare demanded speed and the ability to strike behind enemy lines. Lee, a former infantryman who'd become obsessed with airborne tactics, was chosen to prove the concept could work. He wasn't just building a division. He was fighting for the survival of an idea that half the Pentagon thought was nonsense. The men standing in formation came from every corner of America, drawn by extra pay and the prestige of volunteer service. Paratroopers earned $50 extra per month jump pay that set them apart from regular infantry. But the money wasn't the real draw. These were men who wanted to prove something to themselves and to a country that had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor 9 months earlier. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college athletes who'd left school to enlist. Some had washed out of pilot training and saw parachuting as the next best thing. Others were simply young and immortal in their own minds, unable to conceive of their own deaths. The selection process had been brutal by design. Applicants had to pass rigorous physical tests, pull-ups, distance runs, obstacle courses that eliminated anyone who couldn't handle the extreme demands of parachute operations. Only 60% of volunteers made it through. The ones who remained believed they were special. The Army was counting on that belief to carry them through what was coming. The division's structure reflected the experimental nature of airborne warfare. 4 regiments formed its core: the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, plus the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Parachute regiments would jump from C-47 transport aircraft, while glider troops would land in flimsy wood and canvas gliders towed behind the same planes. The glider infantry were known as flying coffins crews. Their mortality rate in training was even worse than the paratroopers. Each regiment was designed to be self-sufficient, carrying its own mortars, machine guns, and light artillery. The theory was that paratroopers would be surrounded and cut off from the main army, so they needed to fight independently. This decentralization would prove crucial in combat, but it also meant junior officers and sergeants would make life or death decisions with no higher guidance. The division was being built to reward individual initiative and punish rigid thinking. Whether that philosophy would work under fire remained unknown. Training began immediately and proved more deadly than anyone anticipated. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the division moved in September 1942, parachute training killed or crippled men almost weekly. The T5 parachute was reliable by the standards of the time, but reliable still meant occasional malfunctions. Reserve chutes didn't always deploy. Winds caught men and dragged them across fields, breaking bones and necks. Mid-air collisions during mass drops sent paratroopers plummeting to earth, tangled in each other's shroud lines. In December 1942, 12 men were injured during a single training jump when gusty winds scattered the formation. Pentagon observers noted the casualties and renewed their arguments against airborne operations. Lee responded by intensifying training, arguing that only the toughest preparation would reduce combat casualties. His philosophy was simple and brutal: better to lose men in training than lose entire units in combat because they weren't ready. Physical conditioning went beyond anything regular. Infantry endured. At Camp Toccoa, Georgia, where much of the initial training occurred, Men ran up and down Currahee Mountain, a 1,500-foot peak that became legendary among paratroopers. 3 miles up, 3 miles down became the morning routine, completed before breakfast. Men who couldn't keep pace were dismissed from the program. No appeals, no second chances. The attrition rate hovered around 40%. Nearly half of volunteers couldn't meet the standard. Officers received even harsher treatment, expected to outperform their men, while also mastering the tactical complexities of airborne operations. The punishment for failure was reassignment to regular infantry, a disgrace that motivated men to push through injuries and exhaustion. This crucible created a unique culture. Paratroopers developed an arrogance that regular infantry units resented. They were volunteers when the army was mostly draftees, elite when most soldiers were ordinary, jump qualified when others would never leave the ground. That pride would sustain them through the worst combat of the war, but it also created friction that never fully healed. The equipment paratroopers carried was revolutionary and problematic in equal measure. Each man would jump with 60 to 100 pounds of gear, personal weapons, ammunition, rations, water, demolitions, medical supplies, and specialised tools. The standard M1 Garand rifle was too long to jump with safely, so paratroopers received the M1A1 carbine with a folding stock. Heavier weapons like mortars and machine guns were broken down and distributed among several men to be reassembled after landing. Everything was packed into leg bags, canvas containers that hung from the jumper's leg during the drop, then lowered on a rope seconds before landing. In theory, this prevented injuries from landing with too much weight. In practice, the leg bags tore loose during descent, and paratroopers landed to find their heavy weapons scattered across the countryside. This problem would plague the division through its first combat operations, but nobody realised it until men were already falling into enemy territory. The T-5 parachute itself was a marvel of 1940s engineering, 28 feet in diameter, with 28 suspension lines and a descent rate of 16 feet per second. It worked, most of the time, which was the best that could be said. By May 1943, the division was ready for its final test before deployment. War games in Tennessee would prove whether airborne operations were viable or fantasy. Over 2 weeks, the 101st conducted simulated combat drops, assaults on mock objectives, and coordination with ground forces playing the role of advancing armies. The exercises were chaotic. Planes dropped men miles from their intended zones. Communications broke down completely. Units assembled slowly and with poor coordination, but they accomplished their objectives. Despite the confusion, paratroopers seized and held their targets until relieved by ground forces. The chaos, observers noted, seemed to confuse the enemy as much as it confused the airborne forces. Scattered drops meant defenders couldn't concentrate their forces. They faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of all Allied forces in Europe, watched the exercises and reached a conclusion that would shape the war. Airborne forces worked, not in spite of chaos, but because of it. He ordered the program expanded. The 101st would deploy to England immediately. Their rendezvous with destiny was scheduled for June 6, 1944. The men who boarded troop ships bound for England in September 1943 were no longer the uncertain volunteers who'd stood in formation at Camp Claiborne. They were paratroopers now, qualified jumpers with the silver wings to prove it. They'd survived training that killed 24 of their comrades and broke hundreds more. They'd endured a year of conditioning that transformed civilian bodies into weapons. They'd learned to pack parachutes, jump from moving aircraft, assemble under fire, and fight as isolated units behind enemy lines. They believed they were the best soldiers in the American army. The regular infantry they passed on the docks believed they were arrogant fools who would die in their first combat drop. Both assessments contained truth. What nobody, not the paratroopers themselves, not their commanders, not the skeptics, fully understood was that these men were about to test the limits of human courage in a way few soldiers ever would. They would jump into darkness over occupied France, scatter across miles of hostile territory, and somehow accomplish the impossible. But first, they had to cross the Atlantic and endure 13 more months of waiting, training, and wondering if they would survive their first contact with the enemy. General William C. Lee would never see his division in combat. In February 1944, he suffered a severe heart attack and was relieved of command. His replacement, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was a brilliant staff officer but had never commanded paratroopers. The division mourned Lee's departure as a bad omen. The man who'd built them, who'd believed in them when the rest of the army called them reckless, wouldn't lead them into battle. Taylor inherited a division that was superbly trained but completely untested. Every man had jumped from planes, none had been shot at while descending. Every officer had studied airborne tactics. None had commanded paratroopers in actual combat. The theories that looked brilliant in Tennessee war games would face validation or destruction in the skies over Normandy. In June 1944, the Screaming Eagles would discover if Lee's vision of airborne warfare was genius or delusion. The answer would be written in blood across the hedgerows of France, and it would take decades to fully understand what they'd accomplished on the night they jumped into history. September 5th, 1943, Liverpool Harbour. The SS Samaria slides against the dock as 8,000 American paratroopers crowd the rails, staring at their first glimpse of war-torn Britain. The city stretches before them, scarred by German bombing raids that have left entire neighbourhoods as rubble-filled gaps between buildings. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys. Rain falls in that persistent English way that seems less like weather and more like a permanent condition. The men of the 101st Airborne Division shoulder their duffel bags and march down gangplanks into a country that has been fighting for 4 years while America was still at peace. British dock workers watch the Americans with expressions that mix hope and resentment. These paratroopers are fresh, well-fed, confident to the point of arrogance. They have no idea what war really means. The British do. They've buried tens of thousands of their sons. They've endured the Blitz, rationing, and the constant fear that Hitler will invade. Now these loud Americans arrive with full pockets and easy smiles, and the British don't know whether to embrace them as saviours or resent them as late arrivals to a fight that's already cost Britain everything. The division dispersed to villages across Berkshire and Wiltshire, transforming sleepy English countryside into armed camps. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment settled in and around Alborn, a village of fewer than 2,000 people suddenly hosting 3,000 American soldiers. The 502nd took Chiltern Foliat. The 501st occupied Ramsbury and Littlecote. British civilians opened their homes to officers, while enlisted men crowded into Nissen huts, semicircular metal shelters that were freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. The culture clash was immediate and profound. American paratroopers earned significantly more than British soldiers, and they spent freely in local pubs. British women found the Americans exotic and generous, which created tensions with British servicemen who couldn't compete financially. The phrase oversexed, overpaid, and overhere became the bitter joke among locals. But beneath the friction, real friendships formed. Families invited lonely young Americans to Sunday dinners. Romances blossomed. By the time the division left England, 347 marriages had been arranged between American paratroopers and British women. These weren't casual wartime flings, these were connections forged in the shadow of D-Day, when everyone knew the Americans would soon face death. Training intensified with a focus on the specific challenges of the Normandy invasion. The division conducted endless practice jumps, perfecting the techniques that had been honed in the United States. But England added a new element: coordination with the Royal Air Force and tactical cooperation with British forces. Exercise Tonga in March 1944 brought the problems into sharp focus. Paratroopers jumped at night into simulated combat zones, trying to assemble and assault objectives in darkness. The results were disastrous. Navigation errors scattered men across the countryside. Communications equipment failed in the damp English weather. Infantry and glider forces couldn't coordinate attacks. Officers spent hours searching for their units, only to find men had wandered miles off course. Observers watched the chaos and filed reports questioning whether the airborne assault on Normandy could succeed. The problems weren't theoretical anymore, they were documented failures that suggested D-Day might be a massacre. General Taylor ordered more training, more night jumps, more exercises, but some problems couldn't be trained away. The simple truth was that dropping thousands of men from aircraft in darkness over enemy territory was inherently chaotic, and no amount of practice would change that fundamental reality. Equipment failures discovered during English training should have been addressed but weren't, and this negligence would cost lives. The leg bags designed to carry heavy equipment tore loose during descent with alarming frequency. Paratroopers landed to find their mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons falling separately, often miles away. Radio sets proved fragile and unreliable. The SCR 500 radios that were supposed to provide communication between scattered units worked poorly in ideal conditions and failed completely when wet or damaged by hard landings. Worse, the Air Corps and paratroopers couldn't establish reliable coordination. Pilots weren't trained in low-altitude formation flying at night. Pathfinders elite teams that would jump first to mark drop zones with lights and radar beacons had inadequate equipment and insufficient training time. The Eureka radar transponders that would guide aircraft to drop zones were temperamental devices that worked beautifully in demonstrations and failed under field conditions. Every exercise revealed these problems. Every after-action report documented them. And yet, the invasion timeline didn't permit delays for equipment upgrades or additional training. The division would go to war with the equipment it had, not the equipment it needed. The human cost of training deaths continued through the English period, a grim reminder that airborne operations were dangerous even without enemy fire. 19 men died in training accidents between September 1943 and June 1944. Parachute malfunctions killed 8, aircraft accidents killed 6 more. Training injuries and illnesses claimed the rest. Each death rippled through units, shaking confidence and forcing men to confront their mortality. Funeral services at English churches became too common. British civilians who had opened their homes to young Americans now attended their burials. The division established cemeteries in England where men were laid to rest in soil they'd come to defend. These deaths received no publicity, no recognition in newspapers back home. They were classified as training casualties, bureaucratic statistics that didn't merit attention. But for the men who survived, each funeral was a reminder that jumping from planes was inherently lethal. They would carry this knowledge into combat, understanding that death could come from equipment failure as easily as from enemy bullets. The paratroopers developed a dark fatalism, a sense that they were all living on borrowed time. It bonded them in ways that regular infantry never quite understood. Within the division, leadership conflicts that had simmered during stateside training now exploded into crises that threatened unit cohesion. In Easy Company, 506th Regiment, the tension between Captain Herbert Sobel and his junior officers reached a breaking point. Sobel was a superb training officer, demanding, precise and unrelenting in his standards. He'd transformed Easy Company into one of the fittest, most disciplined units in the division. But his tactical judgment was poor, and his leadership style created resentment among officers and enlisted men alike. In January 1944, the company's junior officers staged a near mutiny, submitting written requests for transfer rather than serve under Sobel in combat. The crisis forced regimental command to intervene. Sobel was reassigned to a staff position, and First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan took command with Lieutenant Richard Winters as his executive officer. Similar conflicts played out across the division as the pressure of impending combat exposed weaknesses in leadership. Some officers thrived under stress, others cracked. The army had limited time to sort them out before bullets started flying. These internal battles, invisible to outsiders, would determine whether units functioned effectively or collapsed under fire. The men knew who they trusted and who they didn't, and that knowledge would prove more important than any tactical plan. By late May 1944, the division was as ready as training could make them, but an undercurrent of doubt ran through the ranks. These men had jumped dozens of times, but never under fire. They'd conducted countless exercises, but never faced an enemy trying to kill them. The veterans of North Africa and Italy who occasionally visited the camps spoke in tones that suggested the paratroopers had no idea what they were facing. Combat, the veterans said, wasn't like training. Combat was chaos and terror and luck, good or bad, determining who lived and died. The paratroopers listened and dismissed these warnings as jealousy from soldiers who weren't airborne qualified. This arrogance would be beaten out of them in Normandy, but in England during the spring of 1944, they remained convinced of their invincibility. They were volunteers, elite, the best troops in the American army. How hard could combat be? The answer would come soon, in darkness over France, when the theoretical became brutally real. June 3rd, 1944, the division entered marshalling areas near Upottery and other airfields across southern England, sealed behind barbed wire and guarded by military police. No communication with the outside world was permitted. Officers gathered their men and revealed the secret that had been months in the planning. The invasion of France would begin on June 5th, weather permitting. The 101st Airborne would jump into Normandy behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. Their mission: secure causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, destroy bridges to prevent German reinforcements, and seize key towns. Maps were distributed showing the drop zones. Intelligence officers briefed the men on German defences, coastal fortifications, artillery positions, infantry units. The briefings made it sound manageable, but the men studied the maps and understood the truth. They would be dropped into occupied territory, surrounded by enemies, with no immediate support. Success depended entirely on their ability to accomplish objectives before German reinforcements arrived. Failure meant annihilation. In the 48 hours before takeoff, men wrote letters home with a finality that suggested they understood the odds. Some letters were cheerful, full of false confidence meant to reassure families. Others were honest farewells from young men who didn't expect to survive. Chaplains held services that drew large crowds. Even soldiers who'd never attended church before suddenly felt the need for divine intervention. Weapons were cleaned and recleaned. Equipment was checked obsessively. Paratroopers painted their faces with charcoal and oil, transforming themselves into creatures that looked barely human. They sharpened knives and tested radios and rehearsed hand signals for the 100th time. Some men were quiet and withdrawn, processing fear in solitude. Others were loud and boisterous, using humour to mask terror. Officers moved among their men, offering encouragement and making mental notes about who seemed steady and who seemed close to breaking. The waiting was agony. Once they boarded the planes, adrenaline would take over. But these final hours, knowing what was coming but unable to act, tested nerves more than combat would. June 5th evening. General Dwight Eisenhower made an unscheduled visit to the airfields where the paratroopers were preparing. He moved among the men, shaking hands, asking about hometowns, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. The weather was marginal, and meteorologists were predicting a brief window of acceptable conditions. Eisenhower had postponed the invasion once already due to storms. He couldn't postpone again without risking the entire operation. So he walked among men who would jump into France in a few hours, carrying the weight of knowing that his decision would determine whether they lived or died. Some of the soldiers Eisenhower spoke with that evening would be dead before dawn. He knew it, they knew it, nobody spoke of it. Instead, they talked about baseball and girlfriends and plans for after the war. Eisenhower left the airfields as darkness fell, returned to his headquarters, and drafted a message accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. Then he waited, as thousands of paratroopers boarded aircraft and prepared to test whether the plan his staff had spent years developing was brilliant or suicidal. The answer would come in darkness over Normandy, when the Screaming Eagles finally kept their rendezvous with destiny. June 5th, 1944, 10:30 in the evening. The roar of engines fills the English sky as 432 C-47 transport aircraft lumber down runways across 9 airfields. Each plane carries 18 paratroopers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the fuselage, weighted down with equipment that makes movement nearly impossible. The aircraft struggle into the air, heavy with fuel and human cargo, forming into V-shaped formations that stretch for miles. Inside the planes, men sit in silence or shout over the engine noise, each processing fear in his own way. Some pray, others sleep or pretend to. A few joke nervously, trying to convince themselves and their friends that they're not terrified. The Air Corps pilots are young, most in their early 20s, and they've never flown a combat mission. Tonight they'll navigate across the English Channel in darkness, fly at 500 feet over occupied France while German anti-aircraft guns try to kill them, then drop their human cargo and somehow make it home. It's the largest airborne operation ever attempted. It's also a navigation nightmare, a gamble that assumes everything will go according to plan. Nothing will go according to plan. The flight across the Channel takes 90 minutes, and for most of that time the ride is smooth. Paratroopers doze or stare at the red lights running along the fuselage ceiling, red for danger, red for not yet. The crew chiefs check static lines, the cables that will automatically deploy parachutes when men jump. Some paratroopers vomit from air sickness or fear, filling the cabin with a sour smell that makes others gag. The weight of equipment is crushing. Each man carries 60 to 100 pounds. Main parachute on the back, reserve chute on the chest, rifle or carbine, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, first aid kit. Some carry explosives for demolition missions, others carry machine gun components or mortar rounds. The leg bags hanging from their harnesses contain even more equipment, heavy weapons that will be lowered on a rope just before landing. In theory, this distributes weight safely. In practice, many leg bags will tear loose during descent, sending weapons tumbling away into the darkness. But that disaster is still ahead. For now, the men sit in uncomfortable silence, counting minutes until they reach France. 1:15 in the morning, June 6th. The Pathfinder teams go first, 30 minutes ahead of the main drop. These are elite soldiers within an elite division, specially trained to mark drop zones with lights and radar beacons. 120 Pathfinders jump into Normandy, scattered across 6 different drop zones. Their mission is to set up Eureka radar transponders and holophane lamps in T-shaped patterns that will guide the main formations to the correct landing areas. Within minutes, it's clear the plan is falling apart. Cloud banks over France scatter the Pathfinder aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire forces, evasive maneuvers, navigation errors compound. Of the 120 Pathfinders, only 38 land in the correct drop zones. The rest are scattered across miles of Norman countryside, some landing in German positions, others in flooded marshes where they drown before escaping their harnesses. The Pathfinders who do reach their zones work frantically to set up equipment, but many transponders are damaged in the drop or malfunction in the damp night air. The lights they manage to activate are too few and too far apart to provide effective guidance. The main drop is coming in minutes, and the navigation system has already failed. 1:30 in the morning. The main body of the 101st Airborne begins jumping into hell. Anti-aircraft fire lights the sky like a deadly fireworks display. German gunners, alerted by the Pathfinder drop, pour fire into the C-47 formations. Tracer rounds every 5th bullet phosphorescent arc up from the ground in streams of red and green. Pilots take evasive action, breaking formation, banking hard, diving or climbing to escape the flak. Inside the aircraft, paratroopers stand hooked to static lines, waiting for the green light that signals go. The aircraft rock and shudder from anti-aircraft impacts. Some planes are hit, engines catching fire, trailing smoke. Others are damaged but stay, airborne long enough to drop their men. 14 aircraft go down, killing everyone aboard. 60 more are hit but survive. The pilots, terrified and disoriented, drop paratroopers wherever they can, ignoring designated drop zones in their desperation to get out of the kill zone. The result is catastrophic scatter. 6,928 paratroopers jump into Normandy. By dawn, only 2,500 will be assembled in organised units. The rest are scattered across 25 miles of enemy territory, alone or in small groups, trying to figure out where they are and what to do. Private John Steele, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment from the 82nd Airborne, experiences the nightmare drop in a way that will become legendary. His plane passes directly over Sainte-Mère-Église, a small town that's already under attack from paratroopers who've landed in the streets. A building is burning, and in the firelight, German defenders can see parachutes descending. They fire upward, killing men before they reach the ground. Steele jumps and immediately realizes he's descending directly into the town square. His parachute catches on the church steeple, leaving him hanging 50 feet above the ground, helpless. German soldiers are shooting paratroopers as they land. Steele plays dead, hanging from the church for 2 hours while the battle rages below. He survives only because the Germans are too distracted by the ground fight to notice him. Finally, around dawn, American paratroopers secure the town and cut him down. Steele's experience terrifying, absurd, somehow survivable, captures the chaos of D-Day better than any official report. Across Normandy, thousands of similar dramas unfold. Men land in trees and drown in flooded fields. They land on German positions and are killed before escaping their harnesses. They land alone in darkness and spend hours searching for friendly forces. The plan has disintegrated, and now survival depends on individual courage and luck. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Regiment, lands in a field several miles from his designated drop zone. He cuts himself free from his parachute and crouches in the darkness, listening for sounds that might indicate friend or enemy. The password for the night is flash, answered with thunder. Winters whispers, flash, into the darkness. Nothing. He crawls forward, finds a hedgerow, and takes cover. Slowly, other paratroopers materialize from the darkness. They challenge each other with crickets, small metal clickers issued to every paratrooper that make a distinctive double-click sound. Click, 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 click. The sound becomes the only reliable way to identify friendlies in the dark. Winters assembles a group of 13 men, none from his own company. They're a mix of officers and enlisted, from different regiments, carrying whatever equipment they managed to hang on to during the drop. Winters, a lieutenant, is the senior officer present. These men don't know him, and he doesn't know them, but they're alone behind enemy lines with German forces searching for them. Winters makes a command decision that will define his entire combat career. Instead of hiding and waiting for dawn, he'll move toward the sound of fighting and find a mission to accomplish. The scattered drop has destroyed the plan, but Winters understands that scattered groups can still fight if they have aggressive leadership. By dawn, this ad hoc unit will accomplish one of D-Day's most significant small unit actions, but right now, at 2 a.m, they're just lost soldiers trying to survive the night. The flooded fields behind Utah Beach become killing grounds for paratroopers weighted down with equipment. The Germans, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's direction, have deliberately flooded low-lying areas by damming rivers and streams. The water is 3 to 4 feet deep in most places, deeper in channels and ditches. Paratroopers descending into these zones have no idea the water is there until they're seconds from impact. They plunge into cold, murky water, and the weight of their equipment drags them under. The parachute harness is designed to be released quickly, but in darkness and panic, with cold water rushing into nose and mouth, men fumble with the catches. Some manage to escape and claw their way to shallow water or dry ground. Others don't. They drown in 4 feet of water, unable to free themselves from equipment that's supposed to keep them alive. 70 men die this way on D-Day, a death that's somehow more terrible than being shot. Their bodies are recovered days later, still tangled in parachute harnesses, a grim testament to the dangers of airborne operations that have nothing to do with enemy action. The survivors who witness these drownings or discover the bodies are traumatized in ways combat doesn't quite match. This is death by miscalculation, by equipment failure, by bad planning. It's preventable death, which makes it harder to accept than dying in combat. By 3:30 in the morning, the scale of the disaster is becoming clear to anyone trying to take stock. Of nearly 7,000 paratroopers who jumped, only a few hundred are assembled at their designated rally points. The rest are scattered, lost, or dead. Communications are virtually non-existent. Most radios were lost or damaged in the drop. Officers can't contact their superiors or their subordinate units. Company commanders don't know where their men are. Battalion and regimental headquarters have no idea what's happening beyond their immediate vicinity. The Pathfinder failure means aircraft dropped men wherever pilots thought was close enough, which in many cases was miles from the intended zones. Some men land so far from their objectives that they spend D-Day trying to reach the battle, never firing a shot. Others land directly on German positions and are killed or captured within minutes. The 628 men who jumped are now fighting hundreds of separate small battles across Normandy, each group isolated and unaware of the others. The Germans are confused too. They're taking fire from all directions, receiving reports of paratroopers in locations that make no tactical sense, unable to understand what the Americans are trying to accomplish. This confusion will save the 101st. The scattered drop that seems like failure is accidentally brilliant. The Germans can't mass their forces to destroy the airborne troops because they don't know where to mass. Instead, they fragment their own units, trying to respond to threats everywhere. The chaos cuts both ways. As dawn approaches, individual paratroopers and small groups begin moving toward the sound of gunfire, hoping to find American forces and discover what they're supposed to do. They navigate by compass when they have one, by instinct when they don't. The Norman hedgerows' thick, centuries-old bushes growing on earthen banks break the landscape into small, enclosed fields. Visibility is often less than 50 yards. Every hedgerow could hide German soldiers. Every field crossing is a potential ambush point. The paratroopers move slowly, cautiously, click-clicking their crickets, hoping the response will be a friendly click-click instead of gunfire. Some groups stumble into German patrols and fierce firefights erupt at point-blank range. Others avoid contact entirely, moving through the night like ghosts. A few extraordinarily lost paratroopers don't rejoin American forces for days, surviving behind enemy lines through a combination of stealth, luck, and help from French civilians. The Normandy drop is supposed to be a precisely coordinated airborne assault. Instead, it's become something closer to guerrilla warfare, with hundreds of small units operating independently, accomplishing whatever objectives they can find, and trying not to get killed before sunrise. The German defenders, veterans of the 91st Air Landing Division, are surprised but not unprepared. They've been expecting an invasion, though not necessarily at Normandy and not necessarily tonight. The sudden appearance of thousands of paratroopers behind their coastal defences is shocking, but they respond with professional competence. Machine gun nests open fire on parachutes visible in the moonlight, Quick reaction forces mount trucks and rush toward reported landing zones. German officers try to make sense of conflicting reports and coordinate a response to an enemy that seems to be everywhere and nowhere. But the Germans have problems too. Their communication systems are disrupted, many units are under strength or poorly positioned, and they're facing an enemy fighting with desperate courage because the alternative is death or captivity. The battle that unfolds across Normandy in the early hours of June 6th is messy, confused, and extraordinarily violent. By dawn, when the beach landings begin and the first light reveals the scope of what's happened, both sides will be trying to understand how to turn chaos into victory. The 101st Airborne has survived its first test of combat. Barely. The real test accomplishing the mission despite the scattered drop is just beginning. June 6th, 4:30 in the morning. The first grey light of dawn creeps across Normandy, revealing a landscape transformed by violence. Lieutenant Richard Winters crouches behind a hedgerow near Brecourt Manor, studying 4 German 105mm howitzers positioned in an open field. These guns are firing on Utah Beach, 4 miles away, where the 4th Infantry Division is attempting to land. Every shell from these howitzers could kill dozens of American soldiers waiting ashore. Winters has 13 men, a mixed group from different companies who've attached themselves to his leadership. They're armed with M1 rifles, a few Thompson submachine guns, and 1 Browning automatic rifle. Against 4 fortified artillery positions defended by 50 or more German soldiers, 13 men should have no chance. But Winters has spent the night moving toward the sound of fighting, and he's learnt something crucial about this scattered battle. The Germans are confused and spread thin. Aggressive action, even by a tiny force, can accomplish disproportionate results. He makes a decision. They'll assault the guns. The attack on Brecourt Manor becomes a textbook example of small unit tactics, though nobody is thinking about textbooks as bullets crack overhead. Winters divides his men into 3 groups. One will provide covering fire from the hedgerow. Another will flank left and assault the first gun position. The third will flank right and be ready to exploit success. It's basic infantry tactics, the kind taught at Fort Benning. But executing under fire is different from practicing in Georgia. Winters leads the assault team, sprinting across open ground while his covering team pours fire into the German positions. The distance is 60 yards an eternity when machine guns are firing at you. 2 paratroopers go down, wounded but not killed. The rest reach the first gun position, throw grenades into the emplacement, and shoot the surviving Germans. 1 gun silenced, 3 to go. The German defenders now understand what's happening and concentrate fire on the Americans. Winters pulls his men back to the hedgerow, reorganises, and prepares to attack the second position. The entire action will take 3 hours and cover less than 200 yards. When it's over, all 4 guns will be destroyed, 12 Germans will be dead or wounded, and Winters' force will have suffered 0 fatalities. The attack will earn Winters the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's 2nd highest decoration for valour. More importantly, it will prove that scattered paratroopers can accomplish critical objectives through courage and tactical skill. Across Normandy, similar small unit actions unfold as dawn reveals the scope of the scattered drop. Private Donald Burgett, separated from his 506th Regiment unit, finds 2 other lost paratroopers in a field. They don't know each other's names, they don't know where they are, but they can hear a German machine gun firing somewhere ahead, and they can see muzzle flashes. Without discussion, the 3 men move forward through the hedgerows, using the vegetation for cover. They approach within 50 yards of the machine gun position, a foxhole with 2 German soldiers firing at unseen targets. Burgett and his companions open fire simultaneously, killing 1 German and forcing the other to flee. They clear the position, take the machine gun, an MG-42, one of the best infantry weapons of the war, and continue forward, now armed with captured equipment. This scene repeats across the battlefield. Small groups of paratroopers, often from mixed units, encounter German positions and attack with aggressive disregard for odds. Sometimes the attacks succeed, sometimes they fail, and men die in Norman fields far from home. But the collective effect is devastating to German defences. The paratroopers are supposed to be organised into regiments and battalions, following a coordinated plan. Instead, they're fighting as hundreds of independent fire teams, each responding to local situations, each creating small crises the Germans must address. The German command structure, designed for conventional warfare, can't adapt to this dispersed threat. At Dead Man's Corner, near the village of Carentan, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment assembles enough strength to face a coordinated German counterattack. Around 8 in the morning, German infantry supported by light armour moves down the road toward American positions. The paratroopers have established a defensive line in the hedgerows, a natural fortress if properly defended. They have bazookas, the M9 anti-tank weapon that's supposed to stop German vehicles. The first bazooka team fires at a German armoured car. The rocket hits but fails to penetrate, bouncing off the armour in a shower of sparks. The armoured car's turret swings toward the Americans and opens fire. The bazooka team dies before they can reload. This is the reality that training didn't prepare them for their weapons don't always work as advertised. But the paratroopers adapt. They let the armour advance into kill zones, then attack the supporting infantry with rifles and machine guns. They use grenades to disable vehicles that bazookas can't penetrate. They call in mortar fire, walking explosions along the road to break up German formations. The battle lasts 3 hours and ends with the German attack repulsed. The 502nd holds Dead Man's Corner, but the cost is 22 Americans killed and 48 wounded. The survivors understand something now that they didn't know yesterday. Combat isn't like training. It's faster, more confusing, and infinitely more final. In Sainte-Mère-Église, the first French town liberated by the Allies, paratroopers from the 505th Regiment, technically part of the 82nd Airborne, but fighting alongside the 101st faced German counterattacks that threatened to retake the town. The paratroopers have held Sainte-Mère-Église since the early morning hours, clearing German defenders in brutal house-to-house fighting. Now, at midday, German armour arrives. 3 French-built Renault tanks, captured and pressed into German service, rumble down the main street firing their cannon at American positions. The paratroopers have no anti-tank weapons heavy enough to stop armour. They improvise. A bazooka team fires at the treads of the lead tank, immobilising it. Infantry with satchel charges, canvas bags packed with explosives, rush the disabled tank and blow it apart. The other 2 tanks withdraw, unwilling to risk the same fate. But the German infantry continues attacking, trying to overwhelm the American positions through weight of numbers. The battle seesaws back and forth, buildings change hands multiple times. By afternoon, both sides are exhausted, low on ammunition, and taking casualties they can't afford. The Germans finally withdraw, conceding Sainte-Mère-Église to the Americans. It's a victory, but it doesn't feel victorious to the men who fought for it. They've learned that holding ground is harder than taking it, and that the Germans will counterattack every position until they run out of soldiers, or Americans do. By noon on D-Day, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer of the 506th Regiment manages to assemble 200 men from his 2nd Battalion, the first organised unit formation since the chaotic night drop. It's a bittersweet moment. Strayer commanded 800 men when he jumped from the C-47s. Now he has 200. The other 600 are dead, wounded, captured, or still scattered across Normandy, trying to reach friendly lines. The men who assemble around Strayer are exhausted, filthy, and traumatised. They've been fighting for 12 hours with no sleep, little food, and constant danger. Some have minor wounds they're ignoring. Others are uninjured physically but showing signs of combat stress, 1,000-yard stares, hand tremors, inability to stop talking, or absolute silence. Strayer gives them an hour to rest, eat, and redistribute ammunition. Then he assigns new objectives. The battalion will move toward the causeways leading from Utah Beach, linking up with the 4th Infantry Division that's landing now. Rest will come later, if they survive. The men understand. They're paratroopers. They volunteered for this. Complaining is pointless. They check their weapons, adjust their equipment, and move out. What else can they do? The hedgerows of Normandy reveal themselves as the worst possible terrain for attacking infantry. These aren't decorative garden. Hedges, they're ancient agricultural boundaries, centuries-old bushes and trees growing on earthen mounds 4 feet high and 4 feet thick. The mounds are reinforced by root systems that make them nearly impenetrable. The spaces between hedgerows, the fields are small, often no more than 50 yards across. This breaks the battlefield into hundreds of tiny compartments, each requiring a separate assault. Defenders in the hedgerows have perfect cover and excellent fields of fire. Attackers crossing the open fields are exposed and vulnerable. The M1 Garand rifle, standard weapon of American infantry, has one advantage here. Its 8-round clip and semi-automatic action allow rapid fire that overwhelms German defenders armed with bolt-action Kar 98s. In the quick, violent engagements of hedgerow combat, The American rifle is superior, but individual weapon quality can't overcome the fundamental problem. Advancing means crossing open ground under fire, again and again, field after field, hedgerow after hedgerow. The 101st will fight in this terrain for 33 days. By the end, veterans will have developed techniques for hedgerow warfare that will be taught to other units. But on D-Day, they're learning through trial and error, and the learning curve is written in casualties. German response to the airborne invasion is confused, but not ineffective. The 91st Air Landing Division, responsible for defending the sector where the 101st dropped fragments into dozens of small units that fight independently. German officers can't coordinate a division-level counterattack because they don't understand where to attack. Reports come in of American paratroopers north, south, east, and west of every position. The truth that the Americans are scattered and disorganized doesn't help the Germans because their own forces become equally scattered, responding to threats in every direction. Both sides are experiencing fog of war in its purest form. Nobody knows what's happening beyond their immediate vicinity. Radios provide fragmentary information or no information at all. Runners sent with messages often never return. Commanders make decisions based on incomplete intelligence and hope they're not fatal errors. In this environment, the paratroopers' decentralized training proves valuable. American junior officers and NCOs are empowered to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from above. German forces, trained in a more rigid command structure, struggle when cut off from their officers. The result is that American small units often outfight German small units, even when the Germans have superior positions or heavier weapons. Initiative and aggression compensate for the chaos of the drop. As afternoon fades toward evening on D-Day, the survivors begin to understand the scale of what they've accomplished and what it cost. 182 men of the 101st Airborne are confirmed dead. 338 are wounded. 501 are missing. Some will return to the lines over the next days, but many are dead in locations where their bodies won't be found for weeks or months. The division jumped with nearly 7,000 men. Fewer than 5,000 are accounted for by nightfall. That's nearly 30% casualties in less than 24 hours. In any conventional battle, such losses would mean the unit was destroyed and no longer combat effective. But the 101st has accomplished its objectives. The causeways from Utah Beach are secured or being secured. Key bridges are destroyed, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beach. Towns that control road junctions are in American hands. The 4th Infantry Division landed on Utah Beach with only light casualties, precisely because the paratroopers disrupted German defenses and drew forces away from the coast. The airborne assault worked, though not in the way anyone planned. It worked because thousands of individual soldiers, cut off and surrounded, chose to fight rather than hide. It worked because junior leaders took responsibility without orders. It worked because the chaos that seemed like failure actually confused German defences more than any coordinated plan could have. But understanding this won't come for weeks or months when historians analyse the battle. Right now, on the evening of June 6th, the survivors only know they're alive when many friends aren't. And tomorrow, they'll have to fight again. The night of June 6th into June 7th, paratroopers sleep in foxholes and ditches, too exhausted to care about comfort or safety. Some units post guards. Others are too depleted to maintain proper security, gambling that the Germans are as exhausted as the Americans. The gamble pays off. Both sides pause, lick their wounds, and prepare for the next round. For the 101st Airborne, D-Day was the test they'd trained 2 years to pass. They passed, though the passing grade was written in blood. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, consolidating gains, linking up scattered units, preparing to advance inland. But tonight, in foxholes across Normandy, young men who jumped from planes into darkness and survived to see another sunset allow themselves one moment of relief. They're paratroopers. They're screaming eagles. They kept their rendezvous with destiny, and they're still here to tell about it. Many of their friends aren't, and that knowledge will haunt them forever. But right now, exhaustion overwhelms grief. They sleep the sleep of soldiers who fought beyond human endurance, and they do not dream. June 6th, 6:30 in the morning, Utah Beach. The first wave of the 4th Infantry Division hits the sand, and immediately the soldiers face a crisis that will determine whether the entire landing succeeds or becomes a massacre. Stretching inland from the beach are flat, marshy fields, land that Field Marshal Rommel deliberately flooded by damming rivers and breaching dikes. The floodwaters are 3 to 4 feet deep and stretch for 2 to 3 miles. Only 4 causeways, elevated roads barely wide enough for a single vehicle, cross this flooded zone. Without these causeways, the 23,000 men and thousands of vehicles landing on Utah Beach will be trapped in a narrow strip between the ocean and the floodwaters. They'll be compressed into a killing zone where German artillery can slaughter them at will. The 4th Infantry needs those causeways open. The 101st Airborne, scattered across Normandy since midnight, is supposed to have secured them hours ago. But the chaos of the night drop means nobody knows if the paratroopers even reached their objectives. The beach landing commander watches his men struggle inland and realizes the entire operation depends on soldiers he can't see and can't contact. Exit 1 at Pooperville becomes the first test of whether scattered paratroopers can accomplish coordinated objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell's 101st Regiment was assigned this causeway, but Ewell has no idea where most of his men are. He's assembled about 70 paratroopers, less than 10% of his regiment's strength. That's not enough to assault a fortified position under any normal tactical calculation. But these aren't normal circumstances, and Ewell isn't a normal officer. He organises his tiny force into assault teams and moves toward Pooperville, a small village that controls the causeway's inland end. German defenders have positioned machine guns covering the approaches. Ewell's men use hedgerows for cover, advancing in short rushes, pinning down defenders with rifle fire, while others manoeuvre for kill shots. The fight for Pooperville takes 90 minutes and costs 3 American lives. When the village falls, Ewell's paratroopers secure the causeway and wait. At 7 in the morning, infantry from the 4th Division appears, slogging through the shallows, exhausted from the beach landing. The link-up is almost anticlimactic, a brief exchange of unit identifications, confirmation that the causeway is secure, and then the 4th Division pours inland. Utah Beach won't become a killing zone. The first objective is accomplished. Exit 2, further north, becomes a running battle that lasts most of D-Day and demonstrates how thin the margin of success really is. The 502nd Regiment was assigned this causeway, and they have it partially secured by morning. But German forces keep counterattacking, trying to retake the vital crossing. The fighting focuses on a stone farmhouse that overlooks the causeway. Whoever controls the building controls the road. The farmhouse changes hands 3 times in 6 hours. Paratroopers assault it, clear the Germans out room by room, establish defensive positions, and then German counterattacks drive them back out. The 3rd American assault succeeds only because a tank destroyer from the 4th Division arrives and punches holes in the farmhouse walls with its 3-inch gun. With the building's defensive value destroyed, the Germans abandon it. By 10 in the morning, Exit 2 is secure enough for the 4th Division to advance, though German snipers and artillery continue harassing fire throughout the day. The cost for securing this single causeway: 14 Americans killed, 37 wounded, for a few hundred yards of elevated road. But those few hundred yards matter more than miles of territory elsewhere. Without the causeways, Utah Beach fails. With them, the invasion succeeds. Exit 3 requires a level of courage that verges on insanity, and the paratroopers who secure it understand they're probably going to die. The causeway runs through the most exposed terrain, with minimal cover and excellent German defensive positions on the high ground. Captain Charles Shettle of the 502nd Regiment has exactly 19 men, all that remain of his company after the scattered drop and morning fighting. 19 men against an entrenched German position. Shettle doesn't wait for reinforcements because the 4th Division needs this causeway now, not in a few hours. He divides his men into 3 groups. One will provide covering fire. The other 2 will flank the German position from opposite directions, forcing the defenders to choose which threat to engage. It's a tactic that works better with 100 men than 19. But Shettle doesn't have 100 men. The attack begins at 2 in the afternoon. German machine guns open fire immediately, and 2 Americans go down in the first seconds. The survivors keep moving, using every bit of cover, ditches, scattered trees, the slight undulations in the ground. They reach the German position and assault with grenades and rifle fire. The defenders, outnumbered by their own estimates, they thought they were fighting a much larger force retreat. Exit 3 is secure. Shettle's 19 men hold it against 2 German counterattacks over the next 3 hours before 4th Division infantry arrives to relieve them. 4 of the 19 are dead, 9 are wounded. But the causeway is open. Exit 4 presents a different challenge. The Germans have abandoned it, but nobody knows why. Paratroopers from the 506th Regiment approach cautiously, expecting resistance that never materializes. The German positions are empty, recently evacuated, based on warm ashes in fire pits and fresh food in foxholes. The paratroopers secure the causeway without firing a shot and spend the rest of D-Day waiting for a counterattack that never comes. Only later do they piece together what happened. The flooded fields forced the Germans to abandon untenable positions. Rommel's flooding strategy backfired. It created obstacles for the Allies, but it also isolated German units that couldn't maneuver through the water. The defenders at Exit 4 withdrew before they could be surrounded, falling back to better positions inland. For the 101st Airborne, this is the best kind of victory, mission accomplished without casualties. But it's also unsatisfying in a way the veterans can't quite articulate. They spent the night terrified, jumped into darkness, fought through chaos, and now this objective just falls into their hands. War makes no sense, and trying to understand it is pointless. They secure Exit 4 and move on to the next mission. By evening on D-Day, all 4 causeways are in American hands, and the strategic implications are enormous. 23,000 men of the 4th Infantry Division have landed on Utah Beach. Instead of being trapped in a narrow beachhead, they've pushed 2 miles inland, linking up with paratroopers and establishing a defensive perimeter that can resist German counterattacks. Tank destroyers, artillery, and supplies flow across the causeways, building combat power for the advance inland. The contrast with Omaha Beach, 50 miles east, is stark. At Omaha, American forces faced higher cliffs, stronger defences, and no airborne forces to disrupt German rear areas. The result is thousands of casualties and a landing that nearly fails. Utah Beach succeeds with relatively light losses, less than 200 killed, precisely because the 101st Airborne accomplished their causeway mission. But nobody on the beach knows what the paratroopers sacrificed to secure those causeways. The men of the 4th Division see only that the roads inland are open. They don't see the scattered drop, the drowned paratroopers, the small unit actions that cleared German defenders. History will recognise the causeway mission as one of D-Day's decisive factors, but on June 6th, it's just another objective checked off in the chaos of invasion. The German perspective on the causeway battles reveals how close the outcome was to disaster. German commanders recognised the causeways as critical choke points and fortified them accordingly. But the scattered American drop confused their defensive plans. They expected paratroopers to mass at each causeway for coordinated assaults. Instead, American forces appeared in dozens of locations, creating crises everywhere. German units sent to reinforce the causeways were ambushed by paratroopers who weren't supposed to be in those positions. Communication breakdowns meant German commanders didn't know which causeway needed reinforcements most urgently. By the time they organised coherent counterattacks, the 4th Division had landed and reinforced the paratroopers. The window for retaking the causeways closed. German after-action reports blame the failure on the chaos of airborne assault, which is accurate but incomplete. The chaos was an accident of circumstance, bad weather, navigation errors, equipment failures, but the paratroopers' ability to exploit that chaos was deliberate. They'd been trained to operate independently, to take initiative, to accomplish objectives even when cut off from command. That training saved Utah Beach. The human cost of securing the causeways becomes clear as units count their casualties over the next days. 68 men of the 101st Airborne died in the causeway fights. 183 were wounded. These numbers are lower than D-Day's overall casualties, but represent focused losses among the units directly involved in the causeway missions. Companies that jumped with 120 men now field 40 or 50. Platoons are commanded by sergeants because the lieutenants are dead or wounded. The survivors are exhausted in ways sleep won't cure: physical exhaustion from 36 hours of combat, emotional exhaustion from losing friends, psychological exhaustion from constant fear. But the mission isn't over. Utah Beach is secure, but the 101st must now help the 4th Division push inland, clearing German strongpoints and advancing toward the regiment's next objectives. Rest is a luxury that won't come for weeks. The alternative history haunts every analysis of D-Day. What if the paratroopers had failed to secure the causeways? The 4th Infantry Division would have landed into a narrow beach zone with no exits. German artillery would have pounded them with devastating effectiveness. Casualties would have been catastrophic, possibly forcing an evacuation similar to what nearly happened at Omaha Beach. Without Utah Beach as a successful landing site, the entire Normandy invasion becomes more precarious. The western flank remains in German hands, allowing them to concentrate forces against the other beaches. D-Day might still succeed, but the cost would be immeasurably higher. These what-ifs don't comfort the men who died securing the causeways. They don't ease the grief of families who receive telegrams reporting sons and husbands killed in action. But they do provide context for understanding why the 101st Airborne's scattered, chaotic, bloody night drop was actually one of the most successful operations of D-Day. They were supposed to seize the causeways. Against impossible odds, through courage and improvisation, they did exactly that. June 7th, dawn. The causeway battles are over, and the paratroopers who fought them move inland with the 4th Division, transitioning from their airborne mission to conventional infantry operations. They're still scattered, still under strength, still exhausted. But they're also survivors of the worst night of their lives. And that survival brings a grim confidence. They've been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable and proven themselves effective. The fear doesn't disappear, fear is rational, and combat is terrifying, but it's tempered now by experience. They know they can function under fire, they know their training works, they know they can trust the men beside them, even when those men are strangers from different units thrown together by the chaos of the drop. The 101st Airborne is no longer an experimental force of uncertain value. They're combat veterans now, proven in the most important test of all. The causeways behind Utah Beach stand as monuments to their courage, though no monuments will ever be built there. Just 4 narrow roads across flooded fields, unremarkable to any eye that doesn't understand what happened there. But to the men who fought for them, those causeways represent the difference between failure and success, between disaster and victory, between death and survival. They'll carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. June 7th, dawn. Across Normandy, company commanders conduct roll calls, and the true cost of D-Day becomes undeniable. First sergeants shout names into the grey morning light, and too often, silence answers. Easy company. 506th Regiment jumped with 140 men. This morning, 62 respond to their names. 2nd Battalion, 501st Regiment dropped with 800 paratroopers. They count 380 present for duty. The mathematics are brutal and inescapable. The 101st Airborne Division has lost nearly 40% of its combat strength in less than 36 hours. Some of the missing will return over the coming days, men who landed miles off target and are still making their way back to friendly lines. But many are gone forever, their bodies scattered across Norman fields, floating in flooded marshes, or buried in hasty German graves. Officers write names in notebooks with shaking hands, trying to account for every man. The lists grow long. Killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action. Each entry represents a life interrupted or ended, a family that will receive a telegram, a friend who will never come home. The officer casualties reveal a pattern that will plague the division through the entire war. 23% of officers are dead or wounded, compared to 16% of enlisted men. The math explains why officers lead from the front in airborne operations, making them priority targets. German defenders shoot at anyone giving orders, carrying maps, or moving with the confidence that marks leadership. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains in their early 20s absorbed disproportionate casualties because they exposed themselves to rally scattered men and lead assaults. Now, companies designed to be commanded by captains are led by lieutenants. Platoons that should have lieutenants are commanded by staff sergeants. The leadership vacuum creates opportunities for some men battlefield promotions that jump soldiers several ranks in days, but it also strains the chain of command. New leaders must earn trust while simultaneously making life or death decisions. Some rise to the challenge magnificently, others freeze or make mistakes that cost lives. The division has no choice but to adapt. There's no time for formal leadership schools or gradual transitions. You're a sergeant at dawn, a lieutenant by noon, commanding men in combat by evening. Adapt or die. Most adapt. June 8th, Highsville. General Maxwell Taylor establishes the first functioning divisional command post since the drop. And for the first time in 60 hours, the scattered fragments of the 101st begin coordinating as a unified force. Radio communications are slowly restored as equipment is recovered or replaced. Runners establish contact between units that have been fighting independently. Maps are updated with unit positions, German strongpoints, and completed objectives. Taylor surveys the reports and recognises both the miracle and the disaster. The division accomplished every D-Day objective despite catastrophic scatter. They seized causeways, destroyed bridges, disrupted German defences, and enabled the beach landings to succeed. but they did it at staggering cost, and they're nowhere near combat effective by normal standards. A full-strength airborne division should field 12,000 men. Taylor has perhaps 7,000 effectives, men present, armed, and capable of fighting. The rest are casualties or still missing. He requests immediate reinforcements and resupply, knowing that the division faces weeks more combat before relief. The stories of paratroopers returning to American lines after days behind enemy territory become legendary within the division. Private First Class Burton Christensen jumped on D-Day and landed in a German-occupied village, immediately surrounded by enemy soldiers. He hid in a barn for 3 days, surviving on water and raw vegetables stolen from a garden at night. On June 9th, he crawled through German lines under cover of darkness, nearly got shot by American sentries who thought he was infiltrating, and finally convinced them he was a friendly by reciting baseball scores from the 1943 World Series information no German could possibly know. Christensen's story is repeated across the division with variations. Men who spent days evading capture, guided by French civilians who risked death to help them, navigating by compass or stars, living on adrenaline and desperation. Some never made it back, captured by Germans or killed while trying to reach friendly lines. But hundreds succeeded, trickling back to their units individually or in small groups, each with a story of survival that sounds impossible until you hear it from the man who lived it. June 10th, chaplains conduct the first organised burial services, and the division confronts the permanence of loss. Temporary cemeteries are established behind the lines ploughed, fields converted into rows of crosses. Bodies are recovered from drop zones, pulled from flooded fields, collected from hedgerows where they fell. Identification is sometimes impossible, dog tags lost, faces destroyed by wounds, decomposition already advanced in the June heat. Graves registration units work with grim efficiency, cataloguing remains, recording locations, ensuring every body is treated with dignity even when names are unknown. The burial services are brief. Chaplains read from Bibles, prayers are spoken, and men salute fallen comrades before returning to combat. There's no time for extended grief. The war continues. But the services provide a moment of acknowledgement, a recognition that these deaths matter, that these men were more than statistics. For survivors, watching friends buried in French soil creates a complex emotional not guilt for surviving, rage at the waste, sorrow that's bottomless, and a determination to make the deaths mean something by completing the mission. June 11th, replacement troops arrive from England, and the culture shock is immediate and jarring. These are men who've completed jump training but never seen combat. They're clean, rested, excited, and terrified in ways they don't fully understand yet. The veterans men who jumped 4 days ago but already seem decades older watch the replacements with expressions mixing pity and resentment. The new men ask questions about the drop, about combat, about what it's like. The veterans don't know how to answer. How do you explain watching friends drown in 4 feet of water? How do you describe the sound of a bullet passing inches from your head? How do you convey the exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness into a bone-deep weariness that sleep doesn't touch? The veterans mostly stay silent or offer curt, practical advice about keeping your head down and following orders. The emotional gap between combat veterans and replacements will never fully close. The replacements haven't earned the right to the veterans' grief, and the veterans can't share what they've experienced with people who weren't there. Unit strength statistics tell a story of reconstitution that's both impressive and inadequate. By June 11th, the 502nd Regiment reports 58% strength. The 506th is at 62%, the 501st at 54%. The 327th Glider Infantry, which suffered heavily during daylight glider landings, is at 71% better than the parachute regiments, but still significantly under strength. The division as a whole can field about 7,600 effectives, but effective is a generous term. Many men are walking wounded, injuries bandaged and ignored, because they're still mobile and the division needs every rifle. Combat stress cases are increasing, men who survived physically but are psychologically breaking, staring at nothing, jumping at sounds, unable to function. The Army doesn't have a good framework for handling psychiatric casualties in 1944. Some men are sent to rear areas for rest, others are simply told to push through it. A few are quietly reassigned to non-combat roles. The stigma of psychological wounds is severe. Admitting you can't handle combat feels like admitting cowardice, so most men suffer silently and hope they don't crack completely. Equipment recovery becomes an obsession as the division realises how much material was lost in the scattered drop. Only 40% of crew-served weapons, mortars, machine guns, anti-tank guns are accounted for. The rest are scattered across Normandy, buried in flooded fields, or captured by Germans. Supply drops provide replacement equipment, but integrating new weapons while in contact with the enemy is challenging. Soldiers must learn to operate unfamiliar equipment under fire, a recipe for mistakes and casualties. The leg bag problem that plagued the D-Day drop is now documented and undeniable. Official reports note that 70% of leg bags tore loose during descent, scattering equipment across drop zones. The Army promises improved designs for future operations, but that doesn't help the 101st in Normandy. They fight with what they have, scavenge German weapons when American equipment fails, and make do with shortages that would be considered unacceptable in peacetime. War forgives nothing and demands everything. The German situation, revealed through prisoner interrogations and captured documents, shows that the 101st isn't the only force that bled heavily on D-Day. The 91st Air Landing Division, responsible for defending the sector where the paratroopers dropped, is effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. German casualties exceeded 3,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the first 72 hours. Their command structure is shattered, communications are disrupted, and morale is breaking. But the Germans are rushing reinforcements to Normandy, veteran units from the Eastern Front, Waffen-SS divisions, panzer formations that were held in reserve. The paratroopers' respite will be brief. Within days, they'll face counterattacks by forces far more capable than the coastal defence troops they fought on D-Day. The 101st is exhausted, under strength, and still reeling from the chaos of the drop. The Germans are angry, desperate, and determined to throw the Allies back into the sea. The collision between these forces will produce some of the war's most brutal combat. June 12th, the division receives orders to prepare for offensive operations toward Carentan, a critical road junction that connects Utah and Omaha beaches. The men receive the orders with resignation. They'd hoped for relief, for evacuation back to England, for rest. Instead, they're being thrown immediately into another battle. This is the paradox of being elite success. Means you get used harder and more frequently than regular units. The 101st proved themselves on D-Day, so now they're asked to prove it again and again until there's nothing left to give. The paratroopers check their weapons, redistribute ammunition, and prepare to move out. Some write letters home, carefully vague about their location and situation to evade censors. Others simply sit in silence, too tired to talk, too wired to sleep. They're about to discover that D-Day was just the beginning, that the real test isn't surviving one night of chaos, but enduring weeks of grinding combat where every day brings death a little closer. The reunion of the Screaming Eagles is complete. Now comes the hard part, staying alive long enough to make it matter. June 12th, dawn. The road to Carentan stretches ahead of the 101st Airborne like a challenge and a death sentence wrapped together. General Taylor briefs his regimental commanders on the mission with language that doesn't disguise the danger. Carentan is a medieval town of 4,000 people sitting at the junction of 7 roads. It's the link between Utah and Omaha beaches. As long as the Germans hold it, the American beachheads remain separated, allowing German forces to maneuver between them. The town must be taken. Intelligence reports suggest the German garrison is under strength and demoralized. Intelligence, the commanders know from bitter experience, is often wrong. The 502nd and 506th regiments will attack from the northeast in a pincer movement. They'll advance through hedgerows, cross open marshland, and assault a fortified town defended by enemies who know the Americans are coming. This is conventional infantry warfare, the kind that airborne troops weren't designed for, but will have to execute anyway. The attack begins at 0800 hours. There's no time for elaborate preparation. Speed matters more than perfection. Get into Carentan before the Germans can reinforce it. That's the plan. It sounds simple until the bullets start flying. The approach to Carentan introduces the division to bocage warfare at its absolute worst. The Norman hedgerows form a natural defensive system that favours defenders overwhelmingly. Each field is a separate fortified position. Each hedgerow is a wall that must be assaulted. Visibility is measured in yards, not miles. Artillery is devastating because the earthen hedgerow walls channel blast effects, turning explosions into killing zones. Machine guns positioned in hedgerow corners can cover multiple approach routes, creating interlocking fields of fire. German defenders have prepared these positions for weeks, digging foxholes, camouflaging firing positions, pre-registering mortar targets. The Americans are attacking across terrain they've never seen, against enemies they can't spot until they're in killing range. The 506th advances through fields east of Carentan, taking casualties with every hedgerow crossed. 3 men go down to machine gun fire, 4 more to mortar rounds. 2 killed by snipers who are never spotted. The battalion pushes forward because stopping means dying. Sitting still in the open makes you artillery targets. So they advance, hedgerow by hedgerow, paying in blood for every 100 yards. June 13th, dawn, the paratroopers reach Carentan's outskirts and transition from hedgerow fighting to urban combat. Building to building, fighting is even worse in the fields. Every window is a firing position, every doorway an ambush point, every cellar a German strong point. The Germans fight a delaying action, contesting each building but withdrawing before they can be surrounded. This is professional defensive warfare, executing doctrine with competence that frustrates every American advance. The 502nd Regiment clears the northern quarter of town, losing 18 men in 6 hours of fighting. The 506th fights through the eastern neighbourhoods, where German snipers in church towers and upper-story windows pick off anyone who moves carelessly. A paratrooper steps into a street to throw a grenade. A sniper's bullet drops him instantly. His squad mates drag his body to cover, but he's dead before they reach him. Another death in a battle that's accumulating them by the hour. By noon, American forces control half of Carentan, but the Germans still hold the town's centre and the vital road junctions. The battle for Carentan culminates on June 13th, with house-to-house fighting that reduces war to its most primitive form. Grenades thrown through windows, close-range rifle duels in narrow hallways. Soldiers shooting through walls, hoping to hit enemies they can hear but can't see. Second Lieutenant Harry Welsh of Easy Company leads his platoon into a stone building that intelligence claims is unoccupied. The first man through the door is killed by a burst of machine gun fire. Welsh pulls his men back, calls for a bazooka team, and they put 3 rockets through the ground floor windows. The building collapses partially, burying German defenders in rubble. American infantry moves in to clear survivors. 4 Germans surrender, hands raised, covered in dust and blood. 2 more fight to the death in the cellar and are killed with grenades. This scene repeats across Carentan, small, vicious battles for individual buildings, each requiring courage and ruthlessness, each costing lives. By evening, German resistance collapses. The garrison commander orders withdrawal, recognizing that staying means annihilation. The Germans slip out of Carentan under cover of darkness, moving south to defensive positions where they'll make the Americans pay for every further advance. June 14th, morning. Carentan is in American hands, but the victory celebration lasts approximately 30 minutes before German counterattacks begin. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, a veteran unit from the Eastern Front, has been ordered to retake the town at any cost. Their attack comes from the southwest, hitting thinly spread American positions with overwhelming force. SS troops advance in squad rushes, covered by machine gun fire and supported by assault guns, tracked vehicles mounting 75mm cannons. The paratroopers of the 506th Regiment, exhausted from 3 days of continuous combat, suddenly face fresh enemies who outnumber them 3-1. The defensive line begins to buckle. Companies fall back from advanced positions, conceding ground to avoid being overrun. By noon, the Germans are pushing into the southern edges of Carentan. The 506th is on the verge of collapse. This is the crisis point. If the Germans retake Carentan, the entire operation fails. Utah and Omaha beaches remain separated, and the 101st's bloody 3-day battle becomes meaningless. The battle that history will remember as Bloody Gulch saves Carentan through a combination of courage, artillery support, and fortuitous timing. The 506th remnants, 200 men from a regiment that jumped with 2,000, establish a defensive line in hedgerows southwest of town. They're outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of ammunition. German assault guns advance up the road, firing high-explosive rounds into American positions. Paratroopers with bazookas fire back, but the SS troops know how to protect their armour. They advance with infantry screening the vehicles, shooting at bazooka teams before they can fire. The American line is breaking. Then naval gunfire arrives. USS Quincy, a heavy cruiser stationed off Utah Beach, receives fire support requests and responds with 8-inch guns, firing from 12 miles away. The first salvo lands long, overshooting the German positions. Fire control corrects, and the second salvo lands directly on the advancing SS column. 8-inch naval shells are devastating against unarmoured targets. Each round excavates a crater 10 feet across and kills everything within 30 yards. The German advance stops, then retreats. then dissolves into chaos as naval gunfire walks across their positions. The 506th holds Bloody Gulch. Barely. Relief comes from an unexpected source when Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division tanks, tank destroyers, and mechanized infantry arrives mid-afternoon on June 14th. The paratroopers, who've been fighting without armor support since D-Day, watch American tanks roll past their positions with expressions mixing relief and something close to worship. Sherman tanks, with their 75mm guns and heavy armor, are the equalizer the paratroopers have desperately needed. The 2nd Armoured slams into the German counterattack with overwhelming firepower. Tank cannons destroy German assault guns. Machine guns mounted on tank turrets suppress enemy infantry. The Germans, who moments ago were winning, suddenly face disaster. They withdraw in disorder, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded. The 2nd Armoured pursues, pushing the SS troops back 2 miles before darkness forces a halt. Carentan is secure. The American beachheads are linked. The mission is accomplished. The cost is 62 paratroopers killed and 137 wounded in 3 days of fighting for one town. The survivors don't feel victorious. They feel exhausted and hollow and grateful they're not dead yet. June 15th through June 29th, the 101st transitions from mobile operations to static warfare, and the shift is psychologically brutal. They're paratroopers, trained for aggressive action and rapid maneuver. Instead, they're holding defensive lines in hedgerows, enduring German artillery harassment, conducting patrols, and dying in 1s and 2s every day from sniper, fire, and mortar rounds. This is attrition warfare at its worst. No dramatic battles, no clear victories, just daily erosion of strength and morale. The division settles into a nightmare routine. Mornings begin with stand to, everyone on alert for dawn attacks that rarely come. Days are filled with patrol actions, small groups sent into no man's land to locate German positions, capture prisoners for intelligence, or simply prove that Americans still control the space between the lines. Nights bring German artillery bombardments, random and terrifying, designed more to prevent sleep than inflict casualties, but doing both. Men live in foxholes that fill with water when it rains. They eat cold rations because cooking fires draw artillery. They defecate in slit trenches and wash in muddy water. This isn't what they envisioned when they volunteered for airborne service. The medical crisis that develops during these 2 weeks reveals the hidden costs of prolonged combat. 2,500 men report to aid stations with trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions. Feet swell, blister, and become infected. In severe cases, gangrene sets in and amputation is necessary. Trench foot was a plague of World War I, supposedly solved by better equipment and training. But in Normandy's wet hedgerows, wearing the same boots for weeks, unable to dry feet or change socks regularly, the disease returns with a vengeance. The division loses 10% of its combat strength to a condition that's entirely preventable, with proper rest and sanitation luxuries they don't have. Respiratory infections sweep through units living in damp foxholes. Dysentery from contaminated water weakens men already at their physical limits. Combat exhaustion cases multiply. Men who functioned effectively on D-Day are breaking down after weeks of stress with no relief. The division is winning its tactical battles, but losing the war of attrition. The casualty statistics for the period from June 12th through June 29th are numbing in their relentlessness. 4,670 total casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, sick, or injured. That's 39% of the division's strength again. Combined with D-Day losses, the 101st has lost more soldiers than it fielded on June 6th. The division is being sustained only by a constant stream of replacements, but replacements can't replace experience, cohesion, or the bonds formed in training and early combat. The 502nd Regiment, which jumped with 2,000 men, now fields 800 originals, 60% losses. Easy Company, made famous decades later by Band of Brothers, jumped with 140 men and now has 43 originals present for duty. These aren't statistics. They're friends, leaders, the men you trained with for 2 years, gone. The veterans who survive carry guilt that's irrational but overwhelming. Why them and not me? What did I do to deserve survival when better men died? These questions have no answers, but they consume the survivors anyway. June 29th. The division receives orders for withdrawal to Utah Beach and evacuation to England. The relief is so profound that some men weep openly. They've survived. Not everyone, not even most of the men they jumped with, but they personally, individually, improbably survived 33 consecutive days of combat. The march to the beach is surreal. They pass through liberated villages where French civilians cheer and offer wine. They're too tired to celebrate, but they accept the gratitude with nods and exhausted smiles. At the beach, LSTs, landing ship. Tank wait to carry them back across the channel. The men board in silence, find places to sit or lie down, and sleep before the ships even leave shore. They sleep through the channel crossing, through the arrival in England, through being trucked to their old bases in Berkshire. They sleep for days, the kind of sleep that comes from absolute exhaustion. And when they wake, they're back where they started. Except everything is different. They left England as confident, untested paratroopers. They return as hollow-eyed veterans who've seen things that can't be unseen and done things they'll never talk about. The Screaming Eagles have survived Normandy, but Normandy will never stop haunting them. July 10th, 1944, Berkshire, England. The trains carrying the 101st Airborne back from Southampton pull into familiar stations, and British civilians who waved goodbye 2 months ago gather to welcome them home. The civilians expect to see the same confident, boisterous Americans who left in June. Instead, they see ghosts. The men stumbling off the trains are gaunt, filthy, despite attempts to clean up aboard ship, and carry themselves with the careful movements of people who expect violence at any moment. These paratroopers move in small groups, staying close to men they trust, avoiding eye contact with strangers. They speak little. They startle at loud noises. The civilians, who've lived through 4 years of war and know what combat does to men, offer quiet welcomes and don't ask questions. The veterans appreciate the restraint more than they could express. They don't want to talk about Normandy. They want hot food, clean beds, and enough distance from France to believe they might survive this war. The first week back in England is dedicated to rest that doesn't come easily. Men sleep 12, 14, 16 hours a day, but it's not restorative sleep. It's the unconsciousness of bodies pushed beyond endurance, interrupted by nightmares that jolt them awake screaming. The Army's solution is enforced idleness, no training, no duties beyond basic maintenance, no demands. Officers are under orders to let men process the trauma in whatever ways work for them. Some drink heavily at village pubs, drowning memories in English beer. Others write letters home, carefully edited to hide the truth about what they experienced. A few attend church services, seeking answers or absolution for things they've done and seen. Many simply sit, staring at nothing, replaying battles in their minds, wondering if they could have saved friends who died. The Army has no formal psychological support system in 1944. You either handle it yourself or you break. Most handle it after a fashion. Some break quietly and are reassigned. A few break spectacularly and are hospitalized. The majority endures and pretends they're fine. July 21st. The replacement troops begin arriving, and the division faces the challenge of integrating 3,400 new men into a unit that's been decimated twice. The replacements are young, some look 16 despite being 18, and they carry the same confidence the originals had before Normandy. They've completed jump school, they've earned their wings, and they believe that makes them ready. The veterans know better. Jump school teaches you how to fall from a plane. Combat teaches you how to survive when someone is trying to kill you, and those lessons can't be taught in training. The cultural gap is immediate and problematic. Replacements want to hear war stories. Veterans don't want to tell them. Replacements are eager to prove themselves. Veterans are trying to forget what they've already proven. The division is now 54% replacements, more than half the men have never seen combat. This creates a two-tier force: experienced soldiers who know what combat requires, and inexperienced soldiers who think they know but don't. The training regimen, implemented in August, tries to transfer knowledge from veterans to replacements, but some things can't be taught. Combat veterans teach practical skills: how to move through hedgerows without silhouetting yourself, how to recognise the sound of incoming artillery versus outgoing, how to clear a building without getting killed in a doorway. These are valuable lessons, literally life-saving information. But veterans can't teach the psychological aspects: how to function when you're terrified, how to watch friends die and keep fighting, how to kill another human being and live with the memory. Those lessons only come through experience, and experience in combat means some of the replacements will die learning them. The veterans understand this, and it weighs on them. They're training men who they know won't all survive, and that knowledge adds guilt on top of their existing trauma. Some veterans refuse to befriend replacements, creating emotional distance so it hurts less when the new men are killed. Others take the opposite approach, trying to protect and mentor replacements, hoping to increase their survival odds. Neither approach resolves the fundamental problem. Combat will test these men, and some will fail the test fatally. August 20th. Training exercises at the division level test the integrated force of veterans and replacements, and the results are mixed. The replacements are technically proficient, they know their equipment, they follow orders, and they perform adequately in controlled exercises. But they lack the instinctive responses that veterans develop, the ability to make correct decisions under pressure without thinking them through. In one exercise, a mixed unit conducts a simulated night attack. The veterans move with practiced efficiency, using minimal communication, instinctively covering each other's movements. The replacements bunch up, talk too loudly, and move too slowly. In training, this results in criticism and corrective instruction. In combat, it will result in casualties. The officers running the exercises write reports noting the deficiencies but acknowledging there's insufficient time to fully train the replacements before the division deploys again. The solution is to mix veterans and replacements within squads, hoping the experienced men will keep the new men alive long enough to learn. It's not an ideal solution. It's the only solution available. September 1st. The division is designated for Operation Market Garden, and the announcement triggers complex reactions across the ranks. The veterans react with gallows humour, of course. They're being sent back into combat, they're airborne, this is what happens to elite units. The replacements react with excitement mixed with terror. This is what they volunteered for, their chance to prove themselves, and also possibly their deaths approaching. Officers attend planning briefings and learn the scope of the operation. Market Garden is Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's plan to end the war by Christmas 1944. Airborne forces will seize bridges across Holland, creating a corridor for British armour to drive through the Netherlands and into Germany's industrial heart. The 101st will jump near Eindhoven, seize the bridges at Sonnenvegel, and hold them until British ground forces arrive. Intelligence briefings describe light, German resistance, demoralised troops, minimal armour, a population ready to welcome liberators. The officers who survived Normandy hear these briefings with deep scepticism. They were told Normandy would be manageable too. Intelligence, in their experience, is consistently optimistic and frequently wrong. September 16th, evening. Final briefings reveal specific details, and the mission seems almost too straightforward to be real. The division will jump in daylight, a dramatic change from the Normandy night drop that caused such chaos. They'll jump from low altitude, just 500 feet, allowing less time for scatter. Pathfinders will mark drop zones, and fighter aircraft will suppress German anti-aircraft guns. The landing should be nearly perfect, allowing for rapid assembly and immediate attacks on objectives. The Sun Bridge is 4 miles from the drop zone. The Vegel Bridge is another 8 miles north. The division will take the bridges, hold them for 48 hours, and then be relieved by British XXX Corps advancing from Belgium. After that, the 101st will be pulled out of Holland and returned to England. Quick in, quick out, almost a commando raid rather than sustained combat. The veterans listen to this plan and recognise it's based on everything going right. Their experience in Normandy taught them that nothing goes right in combat, but they don't voice their scepticism. Orders are orders. They'll jump into Holland, accomplish the mission, and hope they survive to complain about the plan afterwards. The equipment issued for Market Garden reflects lessons learned in Normandy, though not all the lessons. Radios are new models, supposedly more reliable than the sets that failed on D-Day. Parachutes are improved T7 models with better control characteristics. Leg bags have been redesigned with stronger attachment points, theoretically. The division receives additional automatic weapons, more Browning automatic rifles and Thompson submachine guns, recognising that firepower matters more than range in close combat. Each man will carry less weight than in Normandy, allowing for faster movement after landing. These improvements are meaningful, but the veterans know that equipment doesn't win battles, soldiers do. The new radios and improved parachutes might help, but what really matters is whether the men using them can function under fire. The replacements will be tested soon. The veterans hope enough of them survive the test to make the division combat effective for whatever comes after Holland. The night before departure, the atmosphere in camps across southern England is subdued. This isn't the nervous energy of D-Day Eve, this is the grim determination of men who know what combat is and are preparing to do it again. Veterans write letters home with practiced casualness, avoiding anything that might worry families. Replacements write with obvious fear, poorly disguised as confidence. Chaplains hold services that draw crowds from both groups, though for different reasons. Veterans pray for survival. Replacements pray for courage. Some men don't sleep, spending the night checking equipment, cleaning weapons, or simply sitting in silence with friends. Others sleep soundly, having learned in Normandy that rest before combat is too valuable to waste on worry. At dawn, they'll board aircraft bound for Holland. Some will die there, most will survive. None will return unchanged. This is the burden of being elite. You don't get to refuse the missions that break ordinary soldiers, because you're not supposed to be ordinary. The Screaming Eagles are about to fly again, into a battle that will prove easier than Normandy but more frustrating, successful in its objectives but part of a larger operation that fails catastrophically. But that knowledge is still ahead. Tonight, they prepare as soldiers have prepared before battle for thousands of years, with ritual, hope, and the quiet courage of people who face death because duty demands it. September 17th, 1944, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 20,000 feet above southern England, 1,500 sea, 47 transport aircraft assemble into formations that stretch across the sky like a mechanical migration. Inside the planes, paratroopers sit in the familiar uncomfortable silence, weighted with equipment, breathing the metallic smell of aircraft interiors and human sweat. But everything about this jump is different from Normandy. Daylight streams through the small windows, allowing men to see each other's faces instead of red-lit darkness. The formation flying is precise aircraft, maintaining positions with professional competence that comes from months of practice since D-Day. Fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs weave above and around the transport stream, their presence reassuring to men who remember German fighters attacking C-47s over France. The mood isn't confident exactly, but it's determined. The veterans know what's coming. The replacements think they know. Both groups understand that in a few hours they'll be on the ground in Holland, and everything depends on how well they execute the plan. The flight across the English Channel and over Belgium is eerily peaceful. Dutch and Belgian civilians below wave at the massive air armada, understanding that liberation is arriving from the sky. The transport pilots maintain tight formations, following navigation points with precision that was impossible during the Normandy night drop. Anti-aircraft fire is minimal, Allied fighter bombers have suppressed German flak positions during the morning, and what guns remain are quickly destroyed when they reveal their positions by firing. Inside the aircraft, paratroopers stand and hook up to static lines at the 10-minute warning. The crew chiefs check connections with practiced efficiency, ensuring no repeat of the equipment failures that plagued D-Day. The red light glows near the door, and men shuffle forward in the awkward waddle of soldiers carrying too much weight. Then the light turns green. Go. The jumpmaster slaps the first man's shoulder, and the human chain flows out the door, 1 soldier per second, disappearing into the slipstream. 1,300 hours. The drop over Holland is as close to perfect as airborne operations get. Vindication of the Normandy lessons and proof that daylight drops work. Paratroopers exit. Aircraft at 500 feet, parachutes deploy correctly, and men land within sight of their designated drop zones. The scatter that caused such chaos in Normandy is minimal units land together, officers maintain control, and assembly is completed in minutes rather than hours. Only 2% of paratroopers suffer landing casualties, compared to 30% scatter and casualty rates on D-Day. The drop zones are fields near Sonn and Eindhoven, flat and open, defended by German forces that intelligence promised would be light. For once, intelligence is correct. German resistance during the landing is sporadic and ineffective. A few machine gun positions open fire on descending paratroopers but are quickly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the drop. By 1330, the 101st has assembled into organised units and begins moving toward their objectives. The contrast with Normandy is stunning. This is how airborne operations are supposed to work, precisely executed, rapidly assembled, immediately offensive. The veterans breathe easier. Maybe this mission will be different. The advance towards Sunbridge begins at 1400 hours, and the 506th Regiment moves with confidence that comes from experience and good planning. 4 miles of Dutch countryside separate the drop zone from the bridge farms and villages, roads lined with Dutch civilians who emerge from houses waving orange flags and throwing flowers. The reception is overwhelming. These people have lived under German occupation for 4 years, and the arrival of American paratroopers means liberation is real. They offer food, water, information about German positions. Some men report that the Germans are preparing to blow the Sun Bridge, that demolition teams are already in place. The 506th increases its pace, moving from tactical advance to near sprint, desperate to reach the bridge before it's destroyed. They arrive at 14:30 and see the bridge intact, spanning a canal critical to British Armour's advance route. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer orders immediate assault. Companies spread out, preparing to rush the bridge from multiple directions. Then the bridge explodes. German engineers detonate prepared charges, and the span collapses into the canal in a cascade of steel and concrete. The Americans are seconds too late, maybe 30 seconds. The difference between success and failure, between intact infrastructure and twisted wreckage. The destruction of Son Bridge creates the first crisis of Market Garden and reveals how fragile the entire operation is. The plan assumes bridges will be captured intact. British armour can't cross canals on improvised bridges, and building new spans takes time that the operation doesn't have. Engineers rush forward to assess the damage and begin planning a replacement span, but they need equipment and materials that haven't arrived yet. The 506th secures both ends of the destroyed bridge and settles into defensive positions, their primary objective accomplished, except for the critical detail that the bridge no longer exists. Officers Radio Division headquarters reporting the failure, but there's nothing to be done immediately. Other bridges become even more critical now. The Wegel bridges, 8 miles north, must be taken intact. If those fail too, the entire operation collapses. The division redirects forces toward Wegel, pushing hard to ensure no more bridges explode before American forces arrive. September 18th. The 502nd Regiment enters Eindhoven and experiences the liberation of a major European city in a way that's joyful and surreal and completely unlike combat. Eindhoven is a city of 100,000 people, and they pour into the streets in an explosion of orange, the Dutch national colour, banned under German occupation, now worn as flags, armbands, ribbons, clothing. People kiss the paratroopers, press food and drink into their hands, sing national anthems, and weep with relief and joy. Children swarm around soldiers, asking for chocolate and autographs. Women embrace men they've never met, thanking them in Dutch and broken English. The paratroopers, who spent the last 2 months in Normandy fighting Germans who wanted to kill them, can barely process this reception. They're liberators here, heroes, not just soldiers. The disconnect between Normandy's hostility and Holland's gratitude is psychologically disorienting. Some men embrace the celebration, accepting drinks and kisses and promises of dinner invitations. Others stay guarded, unable to turn off the combat mindset that's kept them alive. The veterans scan rooftops for snipers, even while civilians celebrate around them. Trust doesn't come easily when you've learned that relaxing gets you killed. But beneath the celebration, military problems accumulate. The Sun Bridge is destroyed and won't be replaced for 24 hours. British XXX Corps, the armoured column that's supposed to drive from Belgium to Arnhem in 48 hours, is delayed by German resistance and traffic congestion. They're supposed to reach Eindhoven by the end of D-Day, September 17th. They arrive mid-morning on the 18th, 12 hours behind schedule. The delay seems minor, but in an operation where everything is timed to the hour, 12 hours might be fatal. Further north, British 1st Airborne Division is fighting desperately at Arnhem, surrounded and taking heavy casualties. They're supposed to hold the bridge at Arnhem for 48 hours. It's already clear they'll have to hold longer, possibly much longer, and their chances of survival are diminishing by the hour. The 101st isn't responsible for Arnhem. Their mission is the Eindhoven to Wegel corridor, but they hear reports filtering down from the north, and those reports are increasingly grim. September 19th. The German response to Market Garden, slow to develop, now intensifies with dangerous effectiveness. The single highway that connects Eindhoven to Arnhem, a 2-lane road-running arrow straight through flat Dutch countryside, becomes Hell's Highway. German forces attack the road at multiple points, cutting British supply lines and isolating units. The 101st's mission transforms from offensive operations to desperate defensive fighting to keep Hell's Highway open. At Wegel, German panzer units attack from the east, trying to cut the highway and trap British armour north of the break. The 101st Regiment defends Vegel in a battle that's desperate and confused, with German tanks pushing into the town before being destroyed by bazookas and British anti-tank guns. The fighting is close range and brutal. Paratroopers without anti-tank weapons watch helplessly as German Panzer Mark IV tanks roll past their positions, unable to damage the armour with small arms. Other paratroopers risk their lives rushing tanks with satchel charges or bazookas, getting close enough to hit weak points, treads, engine compartments, rear armour. 2 paratroopers die destroying one tank this way, killed by machine gun fire from supporting infantry before they can retreat to cover. September 20th. The battle for Hell's Highway continues, and the 101st fights some of its most intense combat since Normandy. German forces attack at multiple points simultaneously, forcing the division to spread its limited strength across 15 miles of highway. The 107th Panzer Brigade, a veteran unit with heavy tanks and assault guns, hits American positions at multiple locations. Near Sun, where engineers are still building the replacement bridge, German armour almost reaches the canal before being stopped by a desperate defence mixing American paratroopers and British tank destroyers. At Vegel, repeated German attacks force the 501st back into the town itself, fighting building-to-building battles that echo Carentan. The difference is that Carentan lasted 3 days. Hell's Highway will last weeks. The division is being ground down, defending a highway, static warfare that negates every advantage airborne training provides. They're infantry now, ordinary infantry, except they're still being asked to accomplish extraordinary things because they're elite. The resentment builds alongside the casualties. September 22nd. The fate of Market Garden becomes undeniable. The operation has failed strategically, even though the 101st succeeded tactically. British 1st Airborne at Arnhem is being annihilated. Of the 10,000 men who landed, fewer than 2,000 will escape across the Rhine River. The bridge at Arnhem, the farthest and most critical objective, remains in German hands. Without Arnhem, the corridor to Germany is closed. Market Garden's goal of ending the war by Christmas is revealed as fantasy, but the 101st doesn't get to stop fighting just because the larger operation failed. They must hold Hell's Highway because British XXX Corps needs it for supply lines, even though those supplies are going nowhere strategically important now. The paratroopers keep fighting because orders say to fight, and because abandoning the highway means British units to the north get surrounded and destroyed. They're fighting to prevent disaster, not to achieve victory. It's demoralising in ways that are hard to articulate but deeply corrosive to morale. The Dutch civilians who welcomed the Americans as liberators now share the danger as fighting sweeps across their country. Villages become battlefields. Homes are destroyed by artillery fire. Civilians hide in cellars while tanks duel in streets above them. The Dutch resistance provides intelligence and guides American patrols through areas they don't know, taking enormous personal risks. The paratroopers develop deep respect for Dutch courage. These civilians have no obligation to help beyond the basic human decency of aiding people fighting their oppressors, but they help anyway, and some die for it. This is different from France, where civilian attitudes were mixed. The Dutch are unambiguously pro-Allied, and that support makes a psychological difference to soldiers who've spent too long in places where nobody wanted them. Here, they're wanted. Here, their sacrifices mean something visible and immediate Dutch freedom. It doesn't stop men from dying, but it gives those deaths a meaning beyond military objectives and strategic plans. By the end of September, Market Garden is officially over, but the 101st isn't going anywhere. They've accomplished every assigned objective. They've held Hell's Highway despite determined German efforts to cut it. They've saved British XXX Corps from being isolated and destroyed. But strategic failure means their tactical successes don't matter in the larger picture of ending the war. They're still in Holland, still fighting daily battles, still taking casualties. The division has lost approximately 950 men killed, wounded, or missing in 2 weeks of operations. That's lower than Normandy casualty rates, which is small comfort to the families of those 950. The veterans who survived Normandy and now survived Market Garden are a shrinking minority. The division is increasingly composed of replacements. Men whose first combat was Holland, who don't carry the D-Day trauma but have their own nightmares forming. The Screaming Eagles are fighting their third campaign of the war, and the war shows no signs of ending. How much more can be asked of them? The answer, it turns out, is more than anyone thought possible. Holland is just preparation for what's coming in December, though nobody knows that yet. September 24th, 1944, the area between the Niederrhein and Weil rivers becomes known simply as the island, and the name captures everything wrong about the 101st situation. This is flat Dutch. Countryside crisscrossed by drainage canals, devoid of natural cover, completely indefensible by conventional military standards. The division is ordered to establish a defensive line along 20 miles of river frontage, a task that would challenge a full-strength corps being asked of an understrength division. The math doesn't work. 12,000 men covering 20 miles means 1 man for every 9 feet of front line, assuming everyone is on the line simultaneously, with no reserves, no rest, no rotation. In reality, units must maintain depth, keep reserves, and allow exhausted soldiers to sleep. The line stretches dangerously thin. Battalion commanders look at their sectors and realise they're being asked to defend the indefensible. They deploy anyway because orders are orders, and because abandoning the island means German forces can threaten the entire Market Garden corridor. The veterans who survived Normandy and the initial Market Garden drop now face a different kind of hell, not the intensity of assault combat, but the grinding attrition of static defence. The terrain makes every position a potential death trap. The island is pancake flat. Elevation changes, measured in inches rather than feet. There are no hills to anchor defences, no natural strong points, no terrain features that favour defenders. The ground is saturated with water from centuries of Dutch hydraulic engineering, canals, dikes, and deliberate flooding designed to manage water in a country where much of the land sits below sea level. Foxholes fill with water within hours of being dug. Soldiers crouch in liquid mud, unable to escape the cold moisture that seeps through every layer of clothing. The Germans occupy positions across the rivers with excellent observation of American lines. They can see every movement, every position, and they have the artillery to exploit that visibility. German forward observers call in fire missions with devastating accuracy. A group of men gathering for a briefing becomes an artillery target. A supply truck driving to forward positions draws mortar fire. The Americans learn to move only at night, to stay dispersed during the day, to live like hunted animals in terrain that offers no protection. October 5th brings a brief moment of purpose and success when the division conducts Operation Pegasus, an extraction mission for British paratroopers trapped across the Rhine after Arnhem's failure. 138 British soldiers have evaded capture for 2 weeks, hiding in Dutch homes and waiting for rescue. The 101st sends boats across the river under cover of darkness, guided by Dutch resistance fighters who mark crossing points and distract German sentries. The extraction is textbook special operations, silent movement, coordinated timing, aggressive action when discovered. German forces spot the boats mid-crossing and open fire with machine guns, the tracer rounds sketching red lines across the black water. American paratroopers return fire, suppressing German positions while the boats make multiple trips. By dawn, 138 British paratroopers are safe on the southern bank, exhausted and grateful. The Americans lose 4 men killed in the operation. It's a small victory, saving 138 lives at the cost of 4, but it matters psychologically. After weeks of grinding defence with no visible progress, Pegasus proves the division can still accomplish successful offensive operations. The men need that reminder. They need to remember they're hunters, not just hunted. But Operation Pegasus is a brief respite from the reality that dominates October and November daily attrition that bleeds the division white. German artillery and mortar harassment is constant. Not massive bombardments designed to destroy entire units, but steady harassment fire designed to prevent rest, sleep, or any sense of security. 3 rounds land on a position at 0300 hours, killing 1 man and wounding 2. 5 rounds hit a supply dump at noon, destroying rations and ammunition. 2 rounds bracket a command post at dusk, missing everyone but forcing evacuation to a new location. This continues every day, multiple times per day, for weeks. The psychological impact is worse than the physical casualties. Soldiers develop what will later be called shell shock or combat fatigue, or eventually post-traumatic stress disorder, the inability to function under sustained stress. Men die for cover at sounds that aren't incoming fire. Others freeze during actual bombardments, unable to react. Some simply stare at nothing, gone somewhere inside their minds where artillery can't reach them. The division's medical staff has no good treatment protocol. Rest is the only real cure, but there's no rest available. So men break and keep fighting, or break and get evacuated, or somehow find reserves of strength nobody knew existed and endure. The weather deteriorates from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. As October fades into November, early autumn rain becomes late autumn storms, Temperatures drop from cool to cold to freezing. The paratroopers are wearing summer uniforms with inadequate cold weather gear. The Army logistics system hasn't caught up with the reality that the division isn't rotating back to England as planned. They're still here, in Holland, in November, without proper winter clothing. Trench foot reaches epidemic proportions. More than 2,000 men are evacuated with foot injuries that range from painful swelling to infections requiring amputation. The condition is entirely preventable with dry socks, boots that can be removed and dried, and time to care for feet. The soldiers on the island have none of these things. They wear wet boots for weeks at a time, never able to fully dry their feet, watching the skin turn white and soft and eventually begin rotting. Some men try to hide the condition because evacuation for trench foot carries a stigma, leaving your unit over something that isn't a combat wound. Others welcome the evacuation because trench foot means survival, getting off the island before artillery or disease or German assault kills them. The German forces opposite the island are also suffering, but they're defending and the Americans are exposed, which gives the Germans significant advantages. The Wehrmacht units facing the 101st are a mix of veterans and hastily trained replacements, but they're fighting from prepared positions with overhead cover and they're not expected to assault across open ground. They conduct limited offensive operations, patrol actions designed to capture prisoners for intelligence, probing attacks to test American defences, occasional larger assaults to keep the Americans off balance. These attacks are professionally executed and dangerous. On October 20th, a German patrol infiltrates American lines, captures 4 paratroopers from a listening post, and withdraws before a response can be organised. The captured men are never seen again. On November 3rd, a company-sized German force attacks a weak point in the defensive line and nearly breaks through before being stopped by artillery fire called in danger close, landing within 100 yards of American positions. The German attacks never succeed in breaking the American line, but they don't need to succeed, they just need to keep happening, maintaining pressure, preventing rest, continuing the bleeding. Patrol actions become the primary form of offensive operations available to the division, and they're nightmarish exercises in courage and luck. Every night, small groups of paratroopers cross into no man's land or even into German-held territory, conducting reconnaissance, seeking prisoners, or simply proving American presence and aggression. These patrols operate in darkness across terrain they don't know, knowing that German positions could be anywhere. A patrol of 8 men moves toward a suspected German observation post. They navigate by compass, moving slowly through waterlogged fields, every sense straining for signs of enemy presence. They find the observation post a farmhouse and approach cautiously. Is it occupied or abandoned? The patrol leader makes a decision to check. 3 men move forward, while 5 provide cover. They're 10 yards from the house when a machine gun opens fire from a window, killing the point man instantly. The patrol returns fire and withdraws, carrying their dead comrade. The mission fails to capture prisoners, but confirms German presence. The patrol leader files a report that will be used to plan artillery fire. 1 man is dead, 7 return. This scenario repeats nightly across the island. Small tragedies that don't make newspapers but accumulate into significant losses. The relationship between the division and British XXX Corps, which was supposed to relieve them after 48 hours, becomes increasingly strained as weeks stretch into months. British forces are present and conducting their own operations, but they're not in position to fully relieve the Americans. The paratroopers feel abandoned, sent into Holland on promises of quick relief that prove false, now being maintained on the island because there are no other units available to hold the sector. This isn't the British soldiers' fault, they're fighting their own battles and taking their own casualties, but the perception of abandonment corrodes morale. American soldiers make bitter jokes about being temporarily permanent in Holland, about how 48 hours in army planning means 2 months, about whether anyone remembers they're still here. The humour is dark and laced with resentment, but it's humour nonetheless, and humour is how soldiers cope with things beyond their control. If you can laugh about it, even bitterly, you can survive it. The Dutch civilian population shares the suffering, trapped between 2 armies fighting across their homeland. Villages are destroyed by artillery exchanges. Farms are torn apart when they become strong points or assembly areas. Civilians live in cellars, emerging only when absolutely necessary, trying to survive on dwindling food supplies as the fighting disrupts agriculture and commerce. The relationship between the paratroopers and civilians deepens through shared hardship. Dutch families share what little food they have. They provide intelligence on German movements. They hide wounded American soldiers who can't be evacuated. Some Dutch civilians are killed by German artillery or caught in firefights. The Americans try to minimize civilian casualties, but in static warfare across populated countryside, that's impossible. Every artillery mission might hit a house where a family is sheltering. Every patrol might draw fire that endangers nearby civilians. The soldiers carry guilt about this. They came to liberate these people, not to bring war into their homes. But there's no alternative except to abandon Holland, and that's not an option. So the fighting continues, and the civilians suffer, and the Americans carry guilt that adds to their psychological burden. November 15th. The first snow falls on the island, and what was merely uncomfortable becomes genuinely dangerous. The snow doesn't fall in the beautiful, peaceful way of Christmas cards. It falls as wet, heavy sleet that soaks through clothing and turns foxholes into freezing pits. The temperature drops below freezing at night, rises barely above it during the day, and oscillates in a range that maximizes human misery. Frostbite becomes common, adding to the trench foot epidemic. Soldiers wrap their feet in whatever material they can find: newspaper, burlap sacks, pieces of parachute, silk. Nothing works well. The cold is inescapable. It seeps into bones and stays there. Men huddle together for warmth in foxholes designed for one, sharing body heat because the alternative is freezing. They burn. Everything combustible for warmth, wood from destroyed buildings, German propaganda leaflets, even leather equipment when nothing else is available. The smoke from warming fires draws German artillery, so fires must be small and brief. The cold becomes another enemy, as deadly as bullets, killing through exposure and hypothermia rather than violence, but just as fatal. November 25th. After 72 consecutive days in combat, the 101st receives orders for relief. The British 49th Infantry Division will take over the island positions, and the paratroopers will withdraw to Reims, France, for rest and refit. The news spreads through the division with reactions ranging from tears to numb disbelief. 72 days, 2 months, and 12 days of continuous combat. No major unit in the European theatre has endured longer continuous action. The division assembled for Market Garden with 11,000 men. They're withdrawing with approximately 6,400 effectives. That's a loss rate of 41%. 3,792 casualties killed, wounded, captured, missing, medically evacuated since September 17th. The survivors are hollow men, physically depleted and psychologically damaged in ways that won't fully manifest for years or decades. They pack their equipment mechanically, going through motions they've performed 1,000 times. They board trucks that will carry them away from the island, away from the rivers and the mud and the German artillery. They ride in silence, too exhausted even for the relief they should feel. The journey to Reims passes in a blur. Soldiers sleep in the trucks despite the cold and discomfort, sleep born of utter exhaustion. They wake periodically, disoriented, not remembering where they are or where they're going. Some wake screaming from nightmares, startling awake to the reassuring presence of comrades in the truck bed. They arrive in Reims in late November to find barracks, hot food, and clean beds waiting. The army intends for them to rest for several weeks, integrate new replacements, conduct light training, and recover before being committed to combat again. The soldiers fall into beds and sleep for days, that deep unconscious sleep of bodies shutting down for mandatory maintenance. When they wake, they're still exhausted. The kind of tired they feel doesn't go away with sleep. It's soul-deep weariness, the accumulated weight of watching friends die, of living in fear for months, of enduring more than human beings should have to endure. They've survived D-Day, survived Normandy, survived Market Garden, survived the island. They're screaming eagles, elite paratroopers, proven in combat beyond any doubt. They've paid prices that should earn them rest measured in months, not weeks. The army plans to give them 3 weeks. Events will give them even less. On December 16th, 1944, the German army will launch its last great offensive in the West. And the 101st will be thrown into the most famous battle of their history with 9 hours' notice. But right now, in late November, they sleep and dream of nothing, and for a few brief days, they're not fighting. That's the best they can hope for. November 27th, 1944, Reims, France. The ancient cathedral city becomes temporary home to men who've forgotten what safety feels like. The barracks assigned to the 101st are World War I era structures, drafty and utilitarian, but they're paradise compared to Dutch foxholes. Real beds with mattresses. Roofs that don't leak. Floors that aren't mud. The soldiers move through these comforts with the careful hesitation of people who've learnt not to trust good fortune. They sit on beds and wait for something bad to happen. Incoming artillery, orders to move out, the inevitable catastrophe that follows brief moments of peace. Nothing bad happens. The army genuinely intends to give them rest. Hot meals appear 3 times daily in mess halls. Showers with actual hot water are available on demand. Clean uniforms replace the filthy, torn garments they've worn for months. Medical staff conduct examinations, treating injuries that soldiers ignored in combat infections, minor wounds, chronic conditions that were survivable in the field but shouldn't be left untreated. The division is being reconstituted, transformed from a shattered combat unit back into an effective fighting force. The process will take weeks under the Army's plan. They have 3. The first week in Reims is dedicated to absolute rest, and the soldiers respond like broken machines receiving maintenance. They sleep 14, 16, 18 hours per day, waking only to eat and use the latrine before returning to unconsciousness. Their bodies are recovering from months of inadequate food, constant stress, and sleep deprivation. But the rest isn't restorative in any psychological sense. The nightmares are worse in Reims than they were in combat. In Holland, exhaustion and adrenaline suppress dreams. Here, with the body finally relaxing, the mind processes trauma it couldn't deal with during the fighting. Men wake screaming about burning planes, drowning paratroopers, friends dying in their arms. They wake convinced they're back on the island, fumbling for weapons that aren't there, diving off beds toward imaginary cover. Roommates learn to wake screaming men gently, to talk them back to reality, to sit with them until the nightmares recede. Nobody judges. Everyone has nightmares. Combat veterans by December 1944 understand that this is part of the price. The war doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. It follows you home. December 1st, the division begins light training, and the military machine reasserts itself over the temporary peace. Morning formations, equipment inspections, weapons maintenance, physical training. The veterans resent the return to structure after the brief freedom of unscheduled rest. The replacements who've joined the division need the training. They're fresh from the United States, jump qualified but combat ignorant, and they need integration into a unit that's been fighting for 6 months. The new men number approximately 2,300, bringing the division back to approximately 8,600 strength. That's still below the authorized 12,500, but it's combat effective by wartime standards. The replacements are obvious: clean uniforms, eager questions, eyes that haven't seen death yet. They look at the veterans with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. The veterans look at the replacements with pity and the knowledge that some of these fresh-faced men will be dead within weeks. This is the cycle that's repeated since Normandy, losses, replacements, integration, more losses. The division is nominally the same, 101st Airborne that jumped on D-Day, but practically it's a different organisation. Only a minority of men present in December jumped on June 6th. The rest are replacements, men who carry the division's reputation without having earned it themselves yet. The training is deliberately light. The Army understands that burned-out soldiers need recovery time before they're subjected to intensive drilling. But even light training reveals the psychological scars Holland left. During a practice march, artillery sounds from a distant training range cause 3 men to dive for cover reflexively, unable to distinguish practice fire from incoming. During a night navigation exercise, 2 soldiers become disoriented and panic, convinced they're back on the island, lost in enemy territory. Officers and senior NCOs watch for signs of combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare, the inability to concentrate, excessive drinking, violent outbursts. Some men are quietly pulled from line units and assigned to rear area duties. Others receive counselling from chaplains or doctors. Most simply endure, pushing through trauma, because that's what soldiers do. The Army doesn't have resources or doctrine for dealing with mass psychological casualties. The solution is time and hope that time heals. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. December 10th. The division holds a memorial service for the fallen, and the ceremony forces recognition of losses that were too abstract during continuous combat. When you're fighting for survival, you can't fully grieve. Death becomes statistical. We lost 12 men yesterday rather than personal. But in Reims, with time to remember, the statistics become names and faces. The chaplain reads list after list of killed in action. The names take 15 minutes to read. Over 1,700 dead since June 6th. 3 times that many wounded or missing. The survivors stand at attention while the names are read, and many weep openly. These aren't strangers. These are the men they trained. With, jumped with, fought beside. The service concludes with a bugler playing taps, and the sound echoes across the parade ground. Beautiful and unbearably sad. The survivors salute the absent and return to their barracks, carrying grief that will never fully heal. War creates a brotherhood among survivors, but it's a brotherhood defined by loss. Everyone has lost friends, and that shared grief bonds them as tightly as shared danger ever did. The Christmas preparations that begin mid-December seem absurd and necessary in equal measure. The army intends to give soldiers a proper Christmas decorations, special meals, packages from home, USO shows. It's an attempt to inject normalcy into lives that have been anything but normal for 6 months. The soldiers participate with cynical appreciation. They know the holiday celebration is artificial, a brief performance of peacetime rituals in the middle of a war. But they appreciate the effort nonetheless. Mail arrives with packages from home cookies that are mostly crumbs after the Atlantic crossing, letters from family, photos of people they left behind who seem like characters from another life. Some men receive Dear John letters, girlfriends or wives ending relationships because 6 months apart is too long, because they've met someone else. Because waiting for someone who might never come home is too hard. These letters devastate soldiers in ways combat injuries don't. They've survived bullets and artillery and months of hell, and they come back to find the life they were protecting has moved on without them. Other men receive letters full of love and promises and plans for after the war. These letters sustain hope, but also create fear of dying now, so close to having something to return to. The Army's plan calls for several more weeks of rest, followed by possible deployment to a quiet sector for garrison duty, allowing the division to recover fully before being committed to offensive operations. This plan is reasonable and sensible and completely irrelevant to what's actually going to happen. In the Ardennes forest, 100 miles east of Reims, German forces are massing for a surprise offensive. 20 divisions, including elite SS Panzer units, are concentrating in the forest under absolute radio silence. Allied intelligence has no indication that anything unusual is happening. The 101st enjoys Christmas parties and training exercises and discussions about where they might be sent next. They speculate about garrison duty in a quiet sector, maybe Luxembourg or southern France. Some optimists think they might actually get rotated back to England or even home to the United States. The war seems to be winding down. Germany is obviously losing. Maybe the fighting will end before they're thrown back into combat. These hopes are natural and completely wrong. December 12th. General Dwight Eisenhower visits the division during a tour of units in France. He's concerned about a possible German offensive, but doesn't share those concerns with the soldiers he meets. Instead, he thanks them for their service, praises their accomplishments, and promises they've earned rest. The men appreciate the visit from the Supreme Commander. It's recognition that their sacrifices mattered. Eisenhower moves among them, shaking hands, asking about hometowns, projecting confidence. He's carrying knowledge that a major German offensive might be imminent, but intelligence can't pinpoint where or when. The best estimates suggest the Germans lack strength for more than limited local attacks. These estimates will prove catastrophically wrong within days. Eisenhower leaves the division confident they'll have weeks to recover. He's wrong. The Germans are coming, and they're coming soon. And the quiet sector everyone hoped for doesn't exist anymore. December 15th. Unit parties and Christmas preparations continue. Easy Company holds a celebration with alcohol procured through mysterious channels. Soldiers are resourceful when motivation is high. Officers look the other way, understanding that men who've fought as hard as these soldiers deserve a night of forgetting. The party is loud and cheerful and carries undercurrents of desperation. Laugh now because tomorrow might bring orders back to the front. Some men get gloriously drunk. Others stay sober, unable to relax enough to let go. They tell war stories, embellishing the truth for entertainment, turning trauma into narratives with beginnings and middles and ends. Real combat doesn't have that structure, it's just chaos and fear and survival, but the stories impose order on chaos, make the experiences shareable. The party continues past midnight. Men sing songs, badly and loudly. They toast absent friends. They make drunken promises to survive the war and stay in touch afterward. Some of these promises will be kept, most won't. By 0200 hours, the party winds down and men stagger to bunks, drunk and happy, and unaware that their rest is about to end violently. December 16th, 05, 30 hours. 100 miles east, in the Ardennes forest, German artillery opens fire across an 80-mile front. Operation Wacht am Rhein Watch on the Rhine begins with the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. 25 divisions, 250,000 men, crash into American positions held by 4 divisions spread dangerously thin. The objective is to drive to Antwerp, split the British and American armies, capture Allied supply dumps, and force a negotiated peace. It's a desperate gambit by a dying regime, but it's being executed with skill and violence. American positions are overrun, communications are cut, confusion reigns. Within hours, the front collapses along a 60-mile stretch. The Germans are advancing so fast that higher command can't track their progress. Somewhere in the chaos, someone realizes that Bastogne, an insignificant crossroads town in Belgium, might be critical. 7 roads converge there. If the Germans take Bastogne, they can maintain their offensive momentum. If the Americans hold it, the entire German advance slows to a crawl. The question becomes, who can get to Bastogne first? December 17th, evening. The 101st Airborne receives emergency orders, load trucks, and move to Bastogne immediately. No time for detailed planning. No time for full equipment issue. Just go. Now, because the situation in Belgium is desperate and the 101st is the only division available that can respond fast enough. The men receive the orders with disbelief that quickly becomes resignation. 3 weeks. They got 3 weeks of rest. They should have known it wouldn't last. The army doesn't grant long breaks to elite units in the middle of a war. They load trucks in darkness, working by moonlight and hooded flashlights. They're short on winter clothing, most of it is still in supply depots, not yet distributed. They're short on ammunition, the supply system was preparing for weeks of rest, not immediate combat. They're short on everything except courage and experience, and the grim knowledge that they're about to fight again, whether they're ready or not. The convoy rolls out of Reims before midnight, heading northeast through winter darkness toward a town most of them have never heard of. Bastogne. The name means nothing to them yet. Within 2 weeks, it will mean everything. December 18th, evening. The convoy races through Belgian night, and everything about the journey signals disaster. The roads are clogged, with American units retreating in panic, not organised withdrawal, but rout. Soldiers without weapons stream past, heading west, away from the fighting. Vehicles burn in ditches. Civilians flee with whatever possessions they can carry. The paratroopers of the 101st watch this chaos from their trucks and understand they're driving toward catastrophe. The retreating soldiers shout warnings, "The Germans are coming! Get out while you can! It's a slaughter up there!" The paratroopers don't answer. They're moving against the tide of retreat, heading toward the sound of guns. This is what elite units do. They go where others run from. The veterans among them have done this before, on D-Day, in Holland. The replacements experiencing it for the first time are terrified and trying not to show it. The convoy passes through destroyed villages, past abandoned American equipment, through intersections where military police are trying desperately to direct traffic and prevent total chaos. The situation is worse than anyone briefed. This isn't a limited German attack, this is a full-scale offensive. December 19th, dawn. The convoy reaches Bastogne just hours before German pincers close around the town. Bastogne sits in the centre of the Ardennes, a small Belgian town of 4,000 people that happens to sit where 7 major roads intersect. The roads are why it matters. Control the roads, and you control movement through the region. German panzer divisions need those roads to maintain their offensive. American forces need them to channel reinforcements. Bastogne is a prize neither side can afford to lose. The 101st drives into town and deploys immediately, no time for reconnaissance or preparation. Officers consult maps and assign sectors. The 506th takes the east, the 501st takes the west and north, the 502nd takes the south, the 327th Glider Infantry fills gaps. The defensive perimeter is 16 miles around, far too large for the available forces, but there's no choice. Every road leading into Bastogne must be covered. German forces are approaching from all directions. The deployment is hasty and incomplete. Units rushing to assigned positions and digging foxholes in frozen ground while German artillery begins falling. General Anthony McAuliffe, artillery commander, now acting as division commander because General Taylor is in Washington, establishes headquarters in the Heights Barracks in central Bastogne. McAuliffe is a blunt, practical officer without pretensions. He surveys the situation and recognizes they're about to be surrounded with no clear plan for relief. The initial briefing suggested the 82nd Airborne would be sent to Bastogne with the 101st deployed elsewhere. But confusion in the High Command reversed the assignments, sending the 101st to Bastogne and the 82nd to positions north. It's a decision made in chaos that will have enormous consequences. McAuliffe doesn't waste time second-guessing. He has 11,035 men from the 101st, plus approximately 2,500 from other units that were already in or near Bastogne tank destroyers, artillery, battalions, engineers, stragglers from units overrun during the German advance. Against them are converging approximately 45,000 Germans from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division. The math is ugly, but math doesn't tell the whole story. The Americans are paratroopers and they're defending. The Germans are attacking and they need speed. Who has the advantage? They're about to find out. December 19th, 1000 hours. First contact comes as German patrols probe American positions, testing strength and looking for weak points. These are professional probes, executed with the competence of veteran units. German infantry advances under covering fire, uses terrain skillfully, withdraws when faced with strong resistance. The Americans respond with practiced efficiency, defending from hastily dug positions, calling in mortar fire, holding their ground. These initial skirmishes are small, squad-level actions, brief firefights, but they set the pattern for what's coming. The Germans have numbers and momentum. The Americans have determination and defensive terrain. Neither side can afford to lose Bastogne. The Germans, because losing it stalls their entire offensive. The Americans, because losing it means a gap opens in Allied lines that German armour can exploit. So both sides commit fully to a battle that will determine the fate of the larger campaign. December 20th, morning, the German 2nd Panzer Division completes the encirclement of Bastogne, cutting the last roads connecting the town to American lines. The 101st is surrounded. 11,000 men, cut off from resupply and reinforcement, facing 45,000 attackers. Radio messages to higher command confirm the situation. Bastogne is isolated but still in American hands. The response is encouraging and terrifying. Hold Bastogne. Relief is coming. How soon is relief coming? Nobody knows. Days? Weeks? The division settles into siege warfare with only what they carried into town. Ammunition supplies are calculated and rationed. Food is inventoried 4 days of full rations, or 8 days if portions are cut. Medical supplies are inadequate for prolonged siege. Fuel for vehicles is sufficient for maybe 48 hours of operations. After that, tanks and trucks become immobile pillboxes. The division fights on borrowed time. Every hour they hold out, consuming resources that can't be replaced. The defensive perimeter is established with care born from experience. Every road gets blocked with artillery pieces and anti-tank guns. Foxholes ring the town in depth forward positions to detect attacks. Main line of resistance to stop them. Reserves to counterattack penetrations. But the perimeter is too large and the forces are too few. There are gaps, weak points, where a determined German attack might break through. Officers and NCOs position men to cover the most likely attack routes and accept that they can't defend everywhere. Some sections of perimeter are held by nothing more than observation posts, 2 or 3 men watching for German movement, with instructions to fall back and call in artillery if attacked. It's a gamble that assumes the Germans won't find the weak points or won't be able to exploit them before reserves arrive. The gamble will be tested repeatedly over the coming days. December 20th afternoon, the first serious German attack hits the eastern sector, and the violence is stunning. German artillery pounds American positions for 30 minutes, a preparatory bombardment designed to destroy defences and kill soldiers. Then infantry advances, supported by assault guns, tracked vehicles mounting 75mm cannons. The attack hits positions held by the 506th Regiment, veterans who know their business. They let the German infantry advance into kill zones, then open fire with everything available: rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery. The German attack staggers under the weight of fire, takes casualties, and pulls back. It's a probing attack, testing American strength. The test tells the Germans that the Americans are dug in, well armed, and ready to fight. It tells the Americans that the Germans are serious, and this is just the beginning. Both sides prepare for the real battle. The civilian population of Bastogne creates an unexpected crisis. 4,000 Belgian civilians are trapped inside the perimeter with no way to evacuate. They're consuming food that American soldiers need. They're occupying basements that could be used for aid stations or command posts. They're potential casualties if fighting enters the town. But they're also innocent people caught in a battle they didn't choose. McAuliffe makes the pragmatic decision civilians will be concentrated in the town centre, away from the fighting perimeter, and given what protection is possible, but they can't be evacuated and they can't be fully protected. The battle will happen around them and some will inevitably die. It's a moral calculation that war forces save, who you can accept losses you can't prevent, and don't waste resources on impossible tasks. The civilians understand. They've lived through 4 years of German occupation. They know war is cruel. They settle into basements and pray that the Americans hold. December 20th, evening. The temperature drops below freezing, and the soldiers realise they're fighting winter as much as Germans. They're wearing summer uniforms with inadequate cold weather gear. The foxholes they occupy are frozen mud pits that offer no warmth. They can't light fires because smoke draws artillery. They huddle together for warmth, share blankets, and endure. Frostbite begins immediately, affecting fingers and toes and ears. Some men ignore the warning signs because leaving their positions for medical treatment feels like abandoning their friends. Others hide the symptoms because they fear being evacuated, leaving their units to fight without them. The cold is enemy that takes no prisoners. It cripples indiscriminately, caring nothing for courage or determination. By the siege's end, hundreds will be casualties of cold rather than combat. But that knowledge is ahead. Tonight, on December 20th, they simply try to stay warm enough to function, and they watch the darkness for signs of German attack, and they wonder how long they can hold. The supply situation is calculated with grim precision. Ammunition expenditure on December 20th. 800 rounds of artillery, 3,000 rounds of mortar fire, uncounted rifle and machine gun ammunition. If the Germans attack every day with this intensity, ammunition runs out in 4 days. Food consumption. 8,000 men eating 2 meals per day, allowing for wounded who can't eat and civilians who shouldn't be fed from military stocks. Supplies last 6 days. Medical supplies already depleted by treating today's wounded. Morphine running low. Bandages being washed and reused. Plasma for transfusions nearly exhausted. The math is simple and brutal. Without resupply, the division can fight for approximately 1 week before running out of essentials. After that, they're defending with bayonets and rocks. The question becomes, can relief arrive in 1 week? The only answer is that it has to, because the alternative is unthinkable. December 20th, 2300 hours. The first night of the siege, soldiers take turns on watch and try to sleep in frozen foxholes. Some succeed in brief, fitful rest. Others lie awake, too cold and too anxious to sleep, listening for sounds of German infiltrators. The night is surprisingly quiet. Occasional distant artillery, the sounds of vehicles moving somewhere beyond the perimeter, but no major attacks. The Germans are repositioning, bringing up reinforcements, preparing for tomorrow's assault. The Americans use the respite to improve positions, redistribute ammunition, treat wounded, and prepare for what's coming. Nobody believes the Germans will give them another quiet night. The siege of Bastogne has begun, and both sides understand that what happens here will determine the fate of the entire Bulge offensive. The 101st Airborne has held positions in Normandy and Holland. But Bastogne will be different. Bastogne will be the place their legend is written in frozen blood, where they earn a reputation that will last generations. But tonight, in frozen foxholes under winter stars, they're just soldiers preparing to do an impossible job because it's their duty and because their friends depend on them. The story of Bastogne is beginning, and nobody knows how it ends. December 22nd, 11:30 in the morning. 4 German officers approach American lines under a white flag, and the sight is so unexpected that forward observers initially think it's a trick. The Germans are impeccably dressed, their uniforms pressed despite the winter conditions, carrying themselves with the formal bearing of professional soldiers executing an unpleasant duty. They request passage to the American commander, claiming they carry an important message. The request is relayed up the chain, and eventually the German officers are blindfolded and escorted to a command post where they deliver an ultimatum typed on official Wehrmacht stationery. The document is formal, almost courteous in its phrasing, but the message is clear: surrender Bastogne immediately, or face annihilation. The Germans point out that the Americans are surrounded, outnumbered, without hope of relief, running low on supplies. Continued resistance is pointless and will result only in the deaths of soldiers and civilians. Honourable surrender is offered. 2 hours are granted for a response. The German officers are escorted back to their lines, and the ultimatum is delivered to General McAuliffe. McAuliffe reads the surrender demand and responds with a single word that will become one of the war's most famous quotes: nuts. His staff officers aren't sure if that's his actual response, or simply his reaction to reading the demand. McAuliffe clarifies that's his official response to the Germans. Just nuts, nothing more. The staff scrambles to formalise this into something resembling military correspondence. They type a response on official paper. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. It's deliberately unclear whether this is acceptance, rejection, or incomprehension. The ambiguity is intentional. Let the Germans puzzle over American slang. The typed response is delivered to the waiting German officers who read it with confused expressions. They request clarification. An American officer explains in clear terms, it means go to hell. The German officers stiffen, salute with formal correctness, and return to their lines. The surrender demand is rejected. The siege will continue. McAuliffe's response is immediately celebrated among American soldiers. It perfectly captures the defiant, profane humour that sustains troops under impossible conditions. The legend of Bastogne is growing. December 23rd, dawn. The weather breaks, and for the first time in days, the sky's clear. The morning sun illuminates a landscape transformed by battle. Bastogne sits in the centre of a white expanse, foxholes and defensive positions scattered around the perimeter, smoke from artillery strikes rising in dark columns. The clear weather means air support can finally arrive, and the soldiers watch the sky with desperate hope. At 0900 hours, the first C-47 transports appear, flying at low altitude, in formations that stretch across the horizon. These are supply drops, desperately needed, resupply of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The drop zones are marked with coloured panels laid out inside the perimeter. German anti-aircraft guns open fire immediately, black puffs of flak dotting the sky around the slow-moving transports. One C-47 is hit, trailing smoke, but stays aloft long enough to complete its drop before turning back toward Allied lines. The cargo parachutes blossom in the sky, hundreds of them, red and white and olive drab, drifting down toward American positions. The supply recovery becomes a desperate race as paratroopers rush to retrieve bundles before German artillery can destroy them. Some bundles land inside the perimeter, easily recovered. Others land in no man's land or even in German-held territory. The Americans organise recovery teams that dash into exposed areas, grab bundles, and sprint back to cover while German machine guns fire at them. 3 men are killed, recovering supplies, shot while carrying 100-pound bundles across open ground. But the majority of supplies are recovered. 241 C-47 sorties dropped 334 tons of supplies over 3 days, with 95% recovered. The ammunition arrives just in time. Artillery units were down to fewer than 10 rounds per gun. Now they have hundreds. Medical supplies replenish exhausted stocks. Food raises morale even more than its nutritional value would suggest. The soldiers have been on half rations for days, and full meals restore the sense that they're not abandoned, that someone is fighting to keep them supplied. The air support that follows the supply drops transforms the tactical situation from desperate to manageable. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers arrive in waves, circling Bastogne like protective birds of prey. They carry 500-pound bombs and high-velocity air rockets, weapons capable of destroying German armour that ground forces can barely damage. American forward observers direct strikes against German positions with devastating precision. A German column assembling for attack gets caught by a P-47 Flight 8 aircraft diving in sequence, each dropping bombs and firing rockets, tearing the column apart. Tanks explode, infantry scatter, and the attack dissolves before it begins. The Germans, who've operated with near impunity during the overcast days, suddenly face an enemy they can't hide from or defeat. Air superiority matters more than numbers when visibility is good. The paratroopers watch the airstrikes with fierce satisfaction. They're not alone anymore. The Air Corps is fighting for them. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The day begins with coordinated German attacks from 3 directions simultaneously, the most serious threat since the siege began. The Germans understand that air superiority has shifted the balance they must break through before American air power destroys their offensive capability. The attacks hit at Champs to the northwest, Hemmerle to the east, and Marvy to the southeast. These are no longer probing attacks, these are all-out assaults with armour support designed to break the perimeter and flood German forces into Bastogne's centre. At Champs, the 502nd Regiment faces German panzer units advancing through morning fog. The fog negates American air support and allows German armour to approach close before being detected. American anti-tank guns open fire at 300 yards, dangerously close range, where German tanks can return fire effectively. 2 American anti-tank guns are destroyed by direct hits, but the defenders hold, firing until they destroy or disable 4 German tanks. The attack stalls when supporting German infantry can't advance through American machine gun fire. At Hemmerle, the battle degenerates into close-quarters infantry combat when German forces penetrate the outer defensive line and push into the village itself. The 506th fights building to building, room to room, using grenades and rifles and bayonets. A German squad occupies a stone farmhouse and establishes a strong point. American paratroopers assault it 3 times and are repulsed with heavy casualties each time. Finally, a tank destroyer is brought forward to blast the building apart with its 3-inch gun. The wall collapses, burying German defenders in rubble. American infantry moves in to clear survivors. 7 Germans surrender. 3 fight to the death in the cellar. The house changes hands 4 times over 6 hours before finally remaining in American control. This single building, tactically insignificant in any strategic sense, becomes the focus of fighting that kills 32 men. War reduces everything to the immediate, not the fate of nations or the progress of campaigns, but the building in front of you that must be taken or defended because the alternative is death. At Marvy, the attack reaches crisis point when German armour breaks through the outer defences and advances into the village itself. The defenders, a mixed force of paratroopers and tank destroyers, face Panzer Mark IV tanks at ranges where bazooka teams have some hope of success but not much. Private First Class James Hendricks, a bazooka gunner, positions himself in the second floor of a building overlooking the street where German tanks are advancing. He fires at the lead tank from 30 feet above and behind, attacking the thin top armour that bazookas can actually penetrate. The rocket hits and the tank brews up, exploding in a fireball that blocks the street. The German advance stalls, but Hendricks's position is now compromised. German infantry fire into the building, forcing him to evacuate. He grabs his bazooka and runs, reaching American lines with bullets stitching the ground around him. He survives. The tank doesn't. 1 man with 1 weapon, in the right place at the right moment, changes the battle's outcome. This is how defensive battles are won, not through grand strategy, but through individual acts of courage, repeated hundreds of times. December 25th, Christmas Day. The morning is relatively quiet, both sides exhausted from yesterday's fighting. Chaplains hold makeshift Christmas services in basements and foxholes, offering prayers and communion under conditions. Christ himself might recognise soldiers facing death, seeking hope, finding faith in the worst circumstances imaginable. The services are brief because nobody can leave defensive positions for long, but they provide psychological sustenance that matters as much as food or ammunition. Belief that there's meaning beyond the violence, that their sacrifices matter in some larger sense, that they're defending values worth dying for, this keeps men fighting when pure logic says surrender makes more sense. Some soldiers who haven't prayed since childhood find themselves praying now. Others who've always had faith find it tested by the horrors they've witnessed. The chaplains offer no easy answers, just presence and prayers, and the assurance that they're not alone in their suffering. The Germans shell Bastogne throughout Christmas Day, targeting the town centre, where civilians shelter and where American aid stations are treating wounded. It's unclear if the Germans know they're hitting medical facilities, or if they simply don't care. Red Cross flags mark the aid stations, but artillery fired from miles away can't target with that precision. Shells land among civilians, killing families huddled in basements. They land near aid stations, killing medics and wounded soldiers awaiting treatment. The American medical staff works under impossible conditions, treating wounded in basements with minimal lighting, without adequate supplies, under constant threat of bombardment. Surgeons perform amputations by flashlight. Medics use wine bottles as improvised IV stands. Bandages are washed and reused because new ones aren't available. The wounded lie in rows on cellar floors, some crying out in pain, others silent in shock, all depending on medical staff who are doing their absolute best with inadequate resources. This is battlefield medicine in its rawest form, saving who can be saved, comforting who can't, and accepting that some will die who could have been saved in better circumstances. December 26th, 16:45 hours. The sound starts as a low rumble from the south, growing into the unmistakable roar of tanks and heavy vehicles. The men in defensive positions tense, preparing for another German attack. Then someone realizes the engines sound American. Sherman tanks have a distinctive note different from German panzers. The radio crackles with a message. This is 4th Armored Division. We're coming in. Lead elements of General George Patton's relief column have broken through German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The siege isn't over, the perimeter is still under pressure. Fighting will continue for weeks, but the town is no longer isolated. Supplies can flow in. Wounded can be evacuated. Reinforcements can arrive. The soldiers react with emotions they can barely process. Relief, joy, exhaustion, grief for those who didn't survive to see this moment. Some weep openly. Others maintain stony silence, unable to express what they're feeling. The link-up is almost anticlimactic in its execution. Tanks roll into American positions, officers exchange brief greetings, and combat continues around them. But psychologically, everything changes. They held, against impossible odds, surrounded and outnumbered. They held Bastogne long enough for relief to arrive. The cost of the siege is calculated in numbers that fail to capture the reality. 482 men of the 101st killed between December 20th and December 26th. 971 wounded. 214 missing, most of whom will later be confirmed dead or captured. That's 15% casualties in 7 days. Some units suffered worse. Easy Company of the 506 lost 40% of its strength. The defenders beat back repeated German attacks, held a perimeter that shouldn't have been defensible, and accomplished a mission that military analysts later said was nearly impossible. The German offensive, which depended on capturing Bastogne to maintain momentum, ground to a halt around the town. Panzer divisions that should have been driving toward Antwerp were instead tied down fighting for a crossroads they never captured. The Battle of the Bulge would continue into January, but Bastogne was the turning point, the place where German offensive power broke against American defensive determination. The German perspective, revealed through prisoner interrogations and captured documents, shows how close the siege came to succeeding. German commanders believed the Americans would surrender when offered terms surrounded forces usually do. McAuliffe's nuts response shocked them. They believed the Americans would run out of supplies and collapse the air. Resupply prevented that. They believed the weather would prevent American air support long enough for them to win. The weather cleared on December 23rd, the critical moment. The Germans attacked with skill and courage, but they faced soldiers who simply refused to be beaten. The Americans had no escape route, no option except fighting or dying. That desperation created a ferocity German soldiers hadn't encountered before. After Bastogne, German veterans spoke with respect about the American paratroopers. Before Bastogne, they dismissed American soldiers as soft and poorly trained. After Bastogne, they knew better. December 27th, dawn. The siege officially continues, but the character of the battle changes. The Americans transition from desperate defense to cautious offense, pushing outward from Bastogne to expand the corridor. Patton's forces have opened. The Germans transition from offensive operations to delaying actions, fighting to slow the American advance, while their own offensive collapses across the entire Ardennes front. The 101st will fight around Bastogne for 3 more weeks, conducting attacks in winter conditions that kill as effectively as bullets. But the existential crisis is over. They survived the impossible siege. They wrote their names into military history. They became the unit that refused to surrender, that held against overwhelming force, that epitomized American courage in the war's darkest hour. The battered bastards of Bastogne, a nickname they'll earn and wear with pride, have won a victory that will be remembered as long as wars are studied. But that knowledge comes later. Right now, on December 27th, they're just exhausted soldiers, preparing to fight another day because the war isn't over and their job isn't done. The legend of Bastogne is being written in real time, but the men creating that legend are too busy surviving to realize they're making history. December 27th, 0800 hours. General George Patton arrives in Bastogne, and his presence symbolizes the shift from siege to offensive. Patton moves through the positions with his trademark ivory-handled pistols and aggressive rhetoric, praising the defenders and issuing new orders that transform their mission. They're no longer holding Bastogne, they're attacking north from it, clearing German forces from the surrounding territory, expanding the corridor, and destroying what remains of German offensive capability. The soldiers listen to Patton's speech with mixed reactions. They want rest. They've earned rest. Instead, they're being ordered to attack in winter conditions, through snow and ice, against German forces that are retreating but still dangerous. The veterans understand this is how elite units get used. Success breeds more missions, not respite. The replacements are learning the same bitter lesson. Being good at combat means you fight more, not less. Patton leaves after an hour, returning to his headquarters to plan larger operations. The 101st prepares to attack positions they've been defending for a week, an ironic reversal that nobody appreciates. The attack toward Foy begins on January 3rd, and the conditions are worse than anything the division has faced. The temperature hovers around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covers the ground 2 feet deep in places, deeper in drifts. The soldiers advance through this frozen landscape carrying weapons that malfunction in extreme cold rifles whose firing pins freeze, machine guns whose oil congeals into sludge, radios whose batteries die in minutes. They wear every piece of clothing they own, layering uniforms until they can barely move, and still they freeze. Frostbite spreads through the division faster than combat casualties. Men lose fingers and toes to cold that turns tissue black and dead. Some continue fighting with frozen extremities, too committed or too stubborn to leave their units. Others collapse from hypothermia and must be evacuated, adding to the medical system's overwhelming burden. The Germans defending Foy are suffering the same conditions, which makes the battle a contest of who can endure winter better while also trying to kill each other. Easy Company's attack on Foy becomes infamous within the division as an example of how leadership failures cost lives. First Lieutenant Normandy, recently assigned to command Easy Company, leads the attack with hesitation and poor judgment that quickly becomes catastrophic. He moves the company across open ground without adequate reconnaissance, leads them into German fields of fire, and then freezes under pressure, literally stops giving orders, standing motionless while men die around him. The company takes casualties, loses cohesion, and begins to disintegrate. First Lieutenant Ronald Spears, watching from a support position, recognizes the crisis and takes action without orders. He sprints across the fire-swept field, relieves Dyke of command in mid-battle, and rallies the company. Under Spears' leadership, Easy Company completes the assault and secures Foy, but the cost is 21 casualties, including 3 dead. The incident reveals the paradox of replacement. Officers the army needs them because combat depletes leadership, but inexperienced officers get soldiers killed while learning their jobs. There's no good solution, just bad choices and worse choices. January 9th. Neuville falls to the 506th Regiment after 4 days of house-to-house fighting that resembles Stalingrad more than any American battle should. The village sits on high ground overlooking the Bastogne corridor, and German forces defend it with desperate determination because losing it means losing observation over American supply routes. The fighting is room by room, building by building, with grenades and small arms at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. American flamethrower teams, soldiers carrying tanks of napalm that spray fire like water hoses, are brought forward to clear buildings, where Germans have fortified themselves. The flamethrowers are effective and horrifying in equal measure. A burst of flame through a window incinerates everyone inside, killing with terrible efficiency but also with agony that haunts the men who use these weapons. The flamethrower operators don't talk about what they do. They drink heavily when alcohol is available, trying to forget the screams of burning men. Neuville falls on January 9th, and the village is rubble. 90% of buildings damaged or destroyed. Streets littered with German and American dead. Civilians emerging from cellars in shock. 210 American casualties to take 36 buildings. The arithmetic of winter warfare is brutal and getting worse. January 17th. The 101st is officially withdrawn from the Bastogne salient after 49 consecutive days of combat since leaving Reims. 49 days. 7 weeks. The division jumped into Bastogne on December 18th with approximately 8,600 men. They're withdrawing with fewer than 6,000 effectives. 2,700 casualties killed, wounded, captured, or medically evacuated since mid-December. Add those to the Holland casualties, add those to the Normandy casualties, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. The division has suffered over 7,500 casualties since June 6th. That's more than half its authorised strength. The men who jumped on D-Day and are still present for duty are a tiny minority, perhaps 800 originals in a division of 6,000. Everyone else is a replacement, some with months of experience, some with weeks. The division is nominally the same, 101st Airborne, but practically it's been reconstituted twice over. The replacements carry the division's reputation without having built it themselves, a burden some find inspiring and others find suffocating. The promised rest after Bastogne doesn't materialise in any meaningful form. The division is trucked to Alsace-Lorraine, a quiet sector along the Moder River where they're supposed to hold defensive positions while recovering. The term quiet sector proves to be army humour at its darkest. The Germans conduct daily patrol actions, artillery harassment, and small-scale attacks designed to keep the Americans off balance. The 502nd Regiment, assigned a 10-mile frontage along the river, fights daily skirmishes that produce steady casualties. 3 men killed in a patrol ambush, 5 wounded when a bunker takes a direct artillery hit, 2 missing after a reconnaissance patrol doesn't return later confirmed captured. The casualties aren't catastrophic like Bastogne, but they're relentless, grinding down the division's strength without any corresponding gain. The soldiers understand they're holding a position until the spring offensive, maintaining presence without advancing. It's necessary work, but it's not what they volunteered for. They're paratroopers, trained for aggressive action. Instead, they're manning static defences, like ordinary infantry. The trench foot epidemic that began in Holland and continued at Bastogne reaches its peak in Alsace. The cold, wet conditions along the Moder River create perfect circumstances for the condition to flourish. 1,100 men are evacuated with foot injuries serious enough to require hospitalisation, and hundreds more are treated at the regimental level without evacuation. The division loses more men to trench foot than to German action during February. The medical staff is frustrated, trench foot is preventable with proper hygiene, dry socks, and time to care for feet. But soldiers in defensive positions can't leave their foxholes to care for feet. They wear wet boots for days or weeks. They can't rotate to rear areas because there aren't enough men to maintain the line if anyone leaves. So they develop trench foot, and the condition worsens until they can't walk, and then they're evacuated, weakening the line further. It's a vicious cycle with no good solution except pulling the entire division out of line, which the army won't do because there are no units available to replace them. The psychological toll of continuous combat without sufficient rest begins manifesting in ways the army can't ignore. Combat exhaustion cases multiply. Men who functioned effectively through Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne finally break under the accumulated stress. Some become catatonic, staring at nothing, unable to respond to orders or questions. Others become violent, lashing out at friends over trivial provocations. A few attempt suicide, unable to face the possibility of more combat. The division's medical officers document these cases and forward reports to higher command, warning that the 101st is approaching psychological collapse. Elite status has costs. These men have been in combat almost continuously since June, with only brief rest periods that weren't long enough for true recovery. Human beings aren't designed to endure months of life-threatening stress. They break eventually, no matter how strong or brave. The army responds by promising rotation home for men who've been in combat longest. The promise is sincere but impossible to fulfill. The war in Europe isn't over, and experienced soldiers can't be spared when Germany is still fighting. March 1st. The division strength report shows 8,900 men present for duty below authorised strength but higher than it's been since June. The influx of replacements has brought numbers up, but the quality concerns officers who remember what the division was like before casualties and exhaustion depleted it. The current 101st is a different organisation than the one that jumped on D-Day. It's less cohesive because so many soldiers are recent arrivals. It's less experienced because the veterans are a minority. It's less physically capable because months of inadequate rest and nutrition have worn down even the strongest men. But it's also harder in ways the original division wasn't. The men who survived Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne have endured more combat than most soldiers in history. They've learnt lessons bought with blood. They've developed skills that can't be taught in training. They're not the idealistic volunteers who believed being airborne made them invincible. They're pragmatic survivors who understand that combat is chaos and luck matters more than skill. They're less pretty and more dangerous. The division is worn out but not broken, depleted but not defeated. The question nobody asks publicly, but everyone thinks privately: how much more can be demanded of these men? They've fought in every major airborne operation in Europe. They've held Bastogne when military analysts thought it couldn't be held. They've bled and died and endured beyond reasonable expectations. What more is there to prove? The answer comes in late March when the division receives orders for Operation Varsity, another combat jump, this time across the Rhine River into Germany itself. The soldiers receive the orders with resignation so profound it approaches apathy. Another jump. Of course, they're airborne. This is what they do. They'll rig parachutes, board aircraft, jump into enemy territory, and fight until ordered to stop or until they're too dead to continue. It's their job. It's their identity. It's the burden of being elite. You don't get to refuse missions because they're dangerous. You don't get to say you've done enough. You do what you're ordered until the war ends, or you die. The 101st prepares for their final combat jump, wondering how many of them will survive to see Germany's surrender. The war is clearly ending, Germany is collapsing, the Allies are advancing from east and west, defeat is inevitable, but soldiers still die in wars that are ending. The final combat casualties hurt just as much as the first ones. Maybe more, because dying when victory is so close seems especially cruel. But nobody gets to choose when they die. They prepare to jump into Germany, and they hope they survive, and they do their jobs, because that's all they can do. March 24th, 1945, 1000 hours. The sky above the Rhine River fills with aircraft, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. 16,000 paratroopers from American and British divisions, 1,400 gliders, hundreds of transport aircraft, thousands of fighter escorts. The armada stretches across 40 miles of sky, a mechanical migration so vast that civilians on the ground watch in awe. The 101st Airborne is part of this massive assault, their fourth combat jump, crossing into Germany itself to seize bridges and high ground east of the Rhine. Inside the C-47s, the paratroopers sit with the familiar pre-jump tension, but something is different this time. They're veterans now, all of them, even the replacements, have seen combat in Bastogne or Alsace. They know what's waiting below. They're not naive volunteers heading to Normandy or confident troops jumping into Holland. They're exhausted soldiers executing another mission because orders say to jump. The plane rocks from anti-aircraft fire, German flak is heavy despite Allied air supremacy, and men glance at each other with expressions that don't need words. Here we go again. The jump itself is technically perfect, proof that the Army finally mastered airborne operations after 3 years of trial and error. Drop zones are marked accurately. Aircraft fly precise formations at the correct altitude. Pathfinders have established proper navigation beacons. The weather is clear, allowing visual navigation. Paratroopers exit aircraft at 500 feet and land within sight of their designated zones. Assembly takes minutes instead of hours. By 10:30, the division is organised and advancing toward objectives. The contrast with Normandy is stunning. This is how it's supposed to work. No scatter, no drowning in flooded fields, no hours of searching for friendly forces. Just a textbook airborne assault that could be used in training manuals. The veterans appreciate the professionalism but can't help thinking that if Normandy had gone this smoothly, hundreds of friends might still be alive. Progress comes too late for the men who died learning these lessons. German resistance is fierce initially but collapses faster than expected. The Wehrmacht units defending the Rhine drop zones are a mixture of veterans and Volkssturm, the German home guard, consisting of teenagers and old men pressed into service as Germany scrapes the bottom of its manpower barrel. The veterans fight with professional competence, even in a losing cause. The Volkssturm fights with desperation that ranges from fanatical to futile. A 15-year-old boy fires a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket at American paratroopers, destroying nothing but revealing his position. He's killed by return fire before he can reload. An old man, maybe 60, defends a bunker with a World War I rifle, firing until American grenades silence him. These are not the enemies the paratroopers train to fight. These are the remnants of a collapsing regime, throwing children and grandfathers into battle because there's nobody else left. The Americans kill them because combat allows no room for hesitation, but there's no satisfaction in these victories. You don't earn glory killing terrified teenagers and desperate old men. The casualties on March 24 are significant but lower than previous jumps, 159 killed or wounded compared to over 1,000 on D-Day. The difference reflects better planning, better execution, and weaker German defences. But numbers don't capture individual tragedies. Private Joseph Martinez jumps, lands perfectly, assembles with his squad, and is killed by artillery fire 15 minutes after landing, survived the dangerous jump, only to die to random shell fire. Lieutenant Thomas Williams is shot by a German sniper while directing his platoon to an objective. The bullet hits him in the throat, and he drowns in his own blood before medics can reach him. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen's parachute malfunctions, a 1 in 1,000 failure, and he falls to his death while his squad watches helplessly. These men are just as dead as if they died on D-Day. Their families will grieve just as deeply. The fact that this jump had lower casualties than previous operations provides no comfort to the soldiers who die or to the friends who must continue fighting without them. The advance into Germany after the Rhine crossing is surreal. The division covers more ground in 2 weeks than they did in 2 months of Normandy fighting. The Wehrmacht is in full retreat, fighting, delaying actions, but unable to mount serious resistance. The paratroopers capture towns that surrender without fighting, march through villages where white flags hang from every window, process prisoners by the hundreds who are eager to surrender to Americans rather than wait for the Soviets approaching from the east. This is warfare as pursuit rather than combat, dangerous still but fundamentally different from the grinding battles of France and Belgium. The soldiers advance cautiously, because even a collapsing enemy can kill you, but the existential desperation of Bastogne is absent. Germany is losing. Everyone knows it. The question is no longer who wins, but how many more men die before the inevitable surrender. The German civilians present a moral complexity that combat against soldiers never required. In France and Belgium and Holland, the civilians were friendly or neutral people suffering under German occupation, grateful for liberation. In Germany, the civilians are the enemy's population, the people who supported Hitler, who benefited from conquest, who allowed the Nazi regime to exist. But they're also just people, frightened families, old women, children who had no choice in their nation's crimes. The paratroopers pass through German towns and see evidence of comfortable lives, only recently disrupted well-fed civilians, intact homes, prosperity built on plundered Europe. The contrast with the destroyed towns of France and Belgium is striking and anger-inducing. These people lived well while their armies destroyed other nations. Some soldiers respond with harsh treatment, viewing every German civilian as complicit in Nazi crimes. Others respond with the same professionalism they'd show any non-combatant protecting civilians, even though their nation caused this war. The division doesn't have a unified approach. Individual soldiers make individual moral choices about how to treat enemy civilians. April 5th, the division reaches the outskirts of Cologne, and the scale of Allied bombing becomes undeniable. The city is rubble, not damaged, destroyed. 90% of buildings are collapsed or burning. Streets are impassable, filled with debris. Civilians emerge from basements like ghosts, pale and malnourished, shocked into silence. The Americans established camps for displaced persons, processing civilians, separating Nazis from ordinary people, providing basic food and medical care. It's humanitarian work that paratroopers weren't trained for, and many resent. They're soldiers, not social workers. But somebody has to manage the hundreds of thousands of homeless Germans, and the army assigns the task to whoever is available. The men of the 101st distribute rations to hungry children and wonder at the insanity of a war where you kill a nation's soldiers, then feed its civilians. War makes no sense. They've known this since Normandy, but Germany drives the point home with devastating clarity. The race across Germany is also a race against the Soviets, though few soldiers understand the political stakes. Allied commanders want to occupy as much German territory as possible before the Soviets arrive, establishing facts on the ground that will determine post-war borders. The 101st advances quickly not just to defeat Germany but to claim territory before Soviet forces arrive from the east. The soldiers don't care about post-war politics, they want the war over so they can go home. But they follow orders, advancing deeper into Germany, capturing towns and road junctions that will matter when diplomats draw maps in conference rooms. The geopolitical chess game happening above their heads is invisible to them. They're focused on immediate concerns. Where's the next enemy position? When do we get resupply? How much longer until this nightmare ends? The question of what comes after victory begins to dominate conversations during rest periods. Some soldiers have been fighting since June 6, 10 months of almost continuous combat. They've earned enough points under the army's rotation system to go home. But will the army actually let them leave? The Europe First strategy means soldiers who defeated Germany might be redeployed to the Pacific to fight Japan. That possibility is terrifying to men who've already survived more combat than human beings should endure. They joke darkly about Golden Gates in 48, the Golden Gate Bridge, hopefully reached by 1948, 2 years away. The jokes mask genuine fear. They've survived this long against improbable odds. Deploying to the Pacific means testing those odds again, and nobody's luck lasts forever. The soldiers hope desperately that Japan surrenders before they can be redeployed. They hope the atomic weapons being whispered about in rumours will end the war. They hope for anything that means they don't have to fight anymore. The division's final major objective is Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The symbolic value is enormous. Capturing Hitler's personal sanctuary would be a perfect ending to the European war. The race to Berchtesgaden becomes competitive as multiple Allied divisions converge on the target, each wanting the glory of capturing Hitler's eagle's nest. The 101st arrives first, on May 4th, and finds the complex abandoned. Hitler is dead in Berlin. The Nazi leadership has fled or killed themselves. The eagle's nest sits empty except for stunning art, valuable furnishings, and mountains of documents. The paratroopers explore the complex with a mix of curiosity and disgust. This is where Hitler planned the war that killed millions. These comfortable rooms, this magnificent view, this obscene luxury, all built on blood and suffering. Some soldiers take souvenirs, silverware stamped with Nazi insignia, paintings, bottles from Hitler's wine cellar. Others refuse to touch anything, viewing it all as tainted. The looting that occurs is both understandable and problematic. These are the spoils of war, but they're also evidence that should be preserved for history. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war is over. The announcement reaches the division through official channels and radio broadcasts, and the reaction is subdued. There's relief, certainly profound relief, that they survived, but there's no celebration, no jubilation, none of the wild parties that will occur in London and New York and Paris. The men of the 101st are too exhausted, too traumatized, too haunted by absent friends to celebrate. They sit in Austrian towns and German villages and simply absorb the fact that they're not going to die in combat tomorrow. For the first time in 11 months, tomorrow doesn't bring combat. That realization is overwhelming. Some men weep, others sit in silence. A few get drunk on liberated German alcohol and toast dead friends. The war is over, but victory doesn't feel the way they imagined when they volunteered years ago. It feels like survival, not triumph. It feels like ending rather than winning. They're alive, and their enemies are defeated, and the killing has stopped. And that has to be enough, because there's nothing more to feel. The final casualty statistics are compiled in the weeks after VE Day, and the numbers are staggering. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 17,538 total casualties from June 6, 1944 through May 8, 1945. Killed, wounded, captured, or missing. That's 126% of the division's authorised strength. The division was destroyed and rebuilt completely, then destroyed again partially. 4,868 men killed in action or died of wounds, 12,670 wounded or injured. The survivors are a minority. Most men who jumped on D-Day didn't survive the war intact. They were killed, crippled, or sent home with wounds before VE Day. The 101st that exists in May 1945 is composed mostly of replacements, men who joined after D-Day and carry the division's legacy without having created it. The original Screaming Eagles are ghosts now, dead or scattered or so changed by combat that they barely recognise themselves. The division accomplished everything asked of it and more. They jumped on D-Day, fought through Normandy, held Holland, defended Bastogne, and finished the war in Germany. They paid for those accomplishments with blood and sanity and futures that will never be lived. The victory is real, but the cost was almost unbearable. April 27th, 1945. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment approaches Kaufering 4, a sub-camp of the Dachau concentration camp system near Landsberg, Germany. They're conducting a routine clearing operation, searching for remaining German forces, expecting perhaps a brief firefight or more likely empty buildings. Instead, they find hell on earth. The first indication is the smell, human waste and death and disease, so overwhelming that men gag and cover their faces. Then they see the bodies. Dozens of corpses scattered around the perimeter, emaciated beyond recognition as human, left unburied where they fell. Then they see the survivors. 500 people calling them prisoners doesn't capture the reality emerged from barracks that were designed for animals, not humans. These are living skeletons, skin stretched over bones, eyes huge in wasted faces, moving with the slow uncertainty of people too weak to walk properly. The paratroopers stop advancing and simply stare, trying to process what they're seeing. These men have fought across Europe. They've seen death in every form combat produces. But this is different. This is industrialized murder, suffering inflicted deliberately and systematically, evil that combat can't prepare you for. The prisoners approach the Americans cautiously, terrified even of liberators, because terror has been their constant companion. They speak a dozen languages: Polish, Hungarian, Russian, Yiddish, French, German. Few speak English, but communication happens anyway, through gestures and tears and the universal language of relief. The Americans distribute rations, and officers immediately realize their mistake. Giving food to starving people kills them, their bodies too damaged to process normal food. Medics take over, providing careful feeding under medical supervision, but it's too late for some. Prisoners who survived years of starvation die in American arms, their bodies giving out just hours or days after liberation. The soldiers watch helplessly, unable to save people who endured so much, only to die after rescue. The psychological impact is devastating. These men have seen friends killed in combat and accepted it as the fortune of war. But watching concentration camp survivors die after liberation breaks something inside them. This isn't war. This is atrocity. The camp itself reveals the systematic nature of the horror. Barracks designed for 50 people held 200. There are no beds, just wooden platforms where prisoners slept stacked like cargo. There are no sanitation facilities worthy of the name trenches where human waste accumulated. There is evidence of medical experiments prisoners used as test subjects for diseases, surgeries performed without anesthesia, records documenting suffering with scientific precision. The Americans photograph everything, instinctively understanding that this must be documented because people won't believe it without proof. The division's photographers work methodically, capturing images that will later be used in war crimes trials. The photographs are almost unbearable to look at. Piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, the infrastructure of murder laid bare. But they must be taken. The world needs to see what the Nazi regime did, needs evidence that can't be denied or dismissed. The soldiers respond to the camp's discovery in different ways, each processing horror according to their personality and experience. Some become furiously angry, wanting to find the camp guards and kill them on sight. The guards fled before liberation, avoiding justice for the moment. Others become withdrawn, unable to articulate what they're feeling, retreating into silence. A few break down completely, weeping uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the scale of suffering they've witnessed. The division's chaplains work overtime, trying to provide comfort and context to men whose faith in humanity has been shattered. How does a loving God allow this? The question has no satisfying answer. The chaplains offer presence and prayers and the acknowledgement that some evils are beyond human understanding. It's not enough, but it's all they have. The interaction between American soldiers and concentration camp survivors creates bonds that will last decades. The survivors view their liberators as angels, saviors who arrived at the moment of deepest despair. The Americans struggle with being viewed as heroes when they feel they arrived too late. If only we'd advanced faster, if only we'd won the war sooner, maybe more people would have survived. The survivors reject this. Guilt, you came, you freed us, you gave us back our lives. That's everything. Some survivors stay with American units for days or weeks, unable to leave the security of armed soldiers, terrified that Germans will return. The Americans accommodate them, sharing rations and protection, helping them search for family members, or arranging transport to displaced persons' camps. These relationships are often wordless. Language barriers prevent detailed conversation, but they're profound. Liberator and liberated, witness and survivor, bound together by the worst moment of both their lives. May 4th. The division occupies Berchtesgaden and Hitler's Eagle's Nest, and the symbolic victory is undermined by what they now know. Hitler built this mountain retreat with money stolen from conquered nations, decorated it with art looted from Jewish collections, lived in luxury while his regime murdered millions. The complex is beautiful in a way that makes the contrast more obscene. Stunning, alpine views, exquisite furnishings, every comfort imaginable, all purchased with blood. The soldiers explore the buildings with conflicted emotions. This should feel like victory. We've captured Hitler's personal sanctuary. We've won. But after Landsberg, victory tastes like ashes. They defeated the German military, but they can't defeat the memory of what they saw in the camps. That horror will follow them forever. The looting of the Eagle's Nest, becomes controversial immediately and remains disputed decades later. American soldiers take silverware, paintings, bottles of wine, documents, anything portable. Some items are genuinely valuable, stolen art that should be returned to rightful owners. Other items are personal effects or Nazi memorabilia with symbolic value but no legitimate ownership claims. Is taking Hitler's property theft or justice? Is liberating looted art from a Nazi retreat different from stealing? The soldiers don't think about these nuances. They see valuable items abandoned by fleeing Nazis, and they take them. Some items will later be donated to museums or returned to victims' families. Others will be sold or kept as souvenirs. The division's officers try to establish control over the looting, cataloguing valuable items and preventing wholesale theft, but discipline has eroded after years of combat. The men take what they want, feeling entitled to spoils of war, especially from Hitler's personal property. May 5th. Displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, forced labourers, prisoners of war, flood, Allied-controlled zones by the tens of thousands. The 101st helps establish camps to process and care for these people, transforming from combat soldiers to humanitarian workers almost overnight. It's exhausting, frustrating work requiring skills they don't have. They distribute food, arrange medical care, try to reunite families, process documentation, all while dealing with people who've been traumatized beyond imagination. Some displaced persons are cooperative and grateful. Others are angry, demanding, psychologically damaged by their experiences. The soldiers try to help, but often feel inadequate. They can provide food and shelter, but they can't provide healing for trauma this deep. They do their best and hope it's enough. The psychological impact of discovering the concentration camps affects the division in ways that won't fully manifest for years or decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder won't be officially recognised as a diagnosis until 1980, but the veterans of the 101st are experiencing it acutely in 1945. The nightmares that plagued them after combat intensify after Landsberg. Now they dream not just of fighting, but of the camps, of skeletal faces, of suffering they witnessed but couldn't prevent. Some veterans will speak publicly about what they saw, feeling obligated to bear witness. Others will never discuss it, the memories too painful to share. But all of them are changed by what they discovered in Germany. They went to war believing they were fighting for freedom and democracy and American values. Those abstractions became concrete and undeniable in the concentration camps. They saw the literal alternative to freedom, the death camps, the industrialized murder, the logical conclusion of totalitarian evil. Whatever doubts they had about whether the war was necessary evaporated in Landsberg. This war was necessary. This enemy had to be defeated. The cost in American lives was terrible, but the cost of not fighting would have been worse. The division spends the last weeks of the war processing prisoners, caring for displaced persons, occupying German territory, and trying to transition from combat operations to occupation duties. It's anticlimactic and necessary and deeply unsatisfying. They wanted the war to end with a bang, a final battle, a clear victory, something definitive. Instead, it ends with paperwork and humanitarian crises, and the slow bureaucratic process of converting a war machine into a peacekeeping force. The soldiers are impatient to go home, but the army needs occupation troops, and the 101st is assigned to remain in Germany indefinitely. The promise of rotation home, of returning to families and normal life, remains frustratingly vague. How long will they stay? Nobody knows. When can they leave? Nobody knows. The uncertainty is maddening to men who've survived 11 months of combat and just want their lives back. The discovery of the concentration camps recontextualizes everything the 101st endured. The suffering in Normandy, the siege at Bastogne, the grinding casualties across Holland and France and Germany, all of it gains meaning in the shadow of the camps. They didn't fight for nothing. They didn't suffer for abstract principles. They fought against a regime that operated death factories, and they won. And that victory matters more than any individual battle or statistic. The cost was terrible, 17,500 casualties, nearly 5,000 dead, countless men physically or psychologically broken. But the alternative was allowing the Nazi regime to continue operating Landsberg and Dachau and Auschwitz and the hundreds of other camps where millions were murdered. The veterans will carry guilt and trauma for the rest of their lives, but they'll also carry the knowledge that their sacrifices prevented greater evil. It doesn't make the nightmares stop. It doesn't bring back dead friends, but it provides meaning to suffering, and meaning is what allows survivors to endure. The 101st Airborne fought across Europe for 11 months, and in the end, they helped liberate a continent and expose crimes that must never be forgotten. That has to be enough, because there's nothing more to give. May through November 1945, Berchtesgaden, Austria. The 101st Airborne transitions from combat division to occupation force, and the change is psychologically jarring. For 11 months, their purpose was clear: kill Germans, take territory, win the war. Now their purpose is managing defeated enemies, processing displaced persons, enforcing Allied occupation policies, and maintaining order in a conquered nation. It's important work, but profoundly unsatisfying to men trained for aggressive action. They patrol Austrian villages, guard supply depots, investigate Nazi party members, and count the days until they can go home. The rotation system creates constant tension. Men with sufficient points to qualify for discharge wait impatiently for orders that don't arrive. Men without enough points watch resentfully as others leave while they remain behind. The division is slowly disintegrating as the longest-serving soldiers rotate home and replacements arrive who never saw combat. By November, few original D-Day veterans remain. The 101st that will be deactivated in France is a different organisation than the one that jumped into Normandy. The daily routine of occupation duty combines boredom with occasional danger. German resistance has officially ended, but not all Germans receive the message or accept defeat. Werewolf units, fanatical Nazis pledged to continue fighting through guerrilla warfare, conduct occasional attacks on Allied forces. They're ineffective militarily but deadly to individual soldiers. A patrol is ambushed by German holdouts. 2 Americans are killed before the attackers flee. A supply sergeant is murdered in his billet by a local Nazi sympathizer seeking revenge. These incidents are rare, but they keep everyone on edge. You survive the war, you're waiting to go home, and you could still die to a random act of violence by enemies who won't accept that they lost. The soldiers respond by trusting no German civilians, treating every encounter as potentially hostile, maintaining combat alertness even though the war is officially over. The psychological toll of never truly relaxing continues long after combat ceased. The occupation duties also include war crimes, investigations, and some soldiers are assigned to track down concentration camp guards or Nazi officials. It's grimly satisfying work hunting the people responsible for the horrors they witnessed at Landsberg. But it's also frustrating because many perpetrators escaped or successfully blended into civilian populations. The Nazis who ran the camps fled before liberation, taking new identities, disappearing into the chaos of post-war Germany. Some will be caught and tried. Many will escape justice entirely. The soldiers assigned to these investigations document war crimes, interview survivors, collect evidence for trials that will establish legal precedent for crimes against humanity. It's important work that will echo through decades of international law, but the men doing it in 1945 just want to go home. They're tired of Germany, tired of war work, tired of everything except the idea of returning to families they left 2 or 3 years ago. November 30th, 1945. The 101st Airborne Division is officially deactivated in a ceremony at Camp Mourmelon, France. The unit that jumped on D-Day, fought through Normandy, held Bastogne, and helped defeat Nazi Germany is dissolved with administrative efficiency. The division's colours are cased, speeches are made praising their accomplishments, and then the soldiers disperse to other units or processing centres for return home. The deactivation is anticlimactic. No grand celebration, no parade through Paris, just a formation and paperwork and dismissal. The men who built the division's legend over 11 months of combat scatter to the winds, returning to civilian lives or continuing military careers. The division itself ceases to exist, officially erased from the army's order of battle. It seems like an ignoble end to a storied unit, but the army's logic is practical. The war is over, the mission is accomplished, resources must be reallocated. The 101st served its purpose, and now that purpose is concluded. Except the deactivation isn't permanent. In 1948, as tensions with the Soviet Union escalate into Cold War, the army reactivates the 101st as a permanent division. The Screaming Eagles fly again, now based at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The reactivated division bears the same name and lineage as the World War II unit, but it's composed entirely of new men. None of the D-Day veterans are present. They've returned to civilian life or been assigned elsewhere. The new 101st inherits the World War II legacy, the battle streamers, the unit citations, the reputation, but they must build their own identity, prove themselves worthy of the name. Over the following decades, they'll do exactly that, fighting in Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, the 101st becomes a permanent fixture of the American military, the only division to serve in every major American conflict from World War II through the present day. The legacy that began on D-Day continues, carried by new generations of soldiers who wear the Screaming Eagle patch. 1954. The division undergoes fundamental transformation from parachute assault to helicopter assault, embracing new technology while maintaining the same mission, rapid deployment behind enemy lines. The change is controversial among World War II veterans who view parachute jumping as the essence of airborne identity. But the Army recognises that helicopters provide the same capability, with less risk and more flexibility. The 101st becomes an air assault division, trading parachutes for helicopters but keeping the aggressive ethos that defined the World War II unit. The transformation is successful. The division becomes the world's premier air assault force, proving that airborne warfare can evolve beyond parachutes while maintaining the spirit of rapid deployment and aggressive action. The World War II veterans gradually accept that progress requires change, that honouring the past doesn't mean refusing to adapt. The veterans themselves return to civilian life with mixed success. Many transition smoothly, using GI Bill benefits to attend college, starting businesses, building families, integrating their military service into their life stories without being defined by it. Others struggle profoundly with post-traumatic stress, unable to hold jobs, unable to maintain relationships, self-medicating with alcohol, slowly destroyed by wounds that don't show on the body. The most tragic cases are veterans who survived the war only to die decades later from suicide or alcohol-related diseases, or simply giving up on life. In 1945, the Army had no framework for treating psychological trauma. The veterans were expected to come home, readjust to civilian life, and move on. Some could, many couldn't. The ones who struggled did so mostly in silence, because admitting psychological wounds in the 1940s and 50s carried stigma that prevented many from seeking help. The reunions begin in the 1950s and continue for decades, allowing veterans to reconnect with men who shared their experiences. Easy Company of the 506 Regiment becomes particularly close, holding regular reunions and maintaining contact long after the war. Other units have less formal connections, but the bonds remain. Veterans who fought together at Bastogne can talk to each other in ways they can't talk to anyone else, not wives, not children, not therapists. Only someone who was there understands. The reunions are often more cathartic than joyful. Men talk about battles they survived, friends who didn't, the moments that still haunt them. They laugh about absurdities that weren't funny at the time. They cry about losses that still hurt decades later. The reunions provide healing that time alone couldn't accomplish. The recognition that they're not alone in their memories and trauma. 2001, Stephen Ambrose publishes Band of Brothers, a history of Easy Company based on interviews with survivors. The book becomes a bestseller, introducing the 101st story to a generation born decades after the war. 2001, HBO adapts the book into a miniseries that becomes one of the most watched war dramas in television history. The Screaming Eagles become cultural icons, their story told and retold, their sacrifices remembered and honoured. The surviving veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, suddenly find themselves celebrities. They're invited to schools, interviewed by media, honoured at ceremonies. It's overwhelming and gratifying in equal measure. For decades, they lived quietly, with memories that few people cared about. Now everyone wants to hear their stories, to thank them for their service, to honour their sacrifices. Some veterans embrace the attention, recognising it as validation that their suffering meant something. Others are uncomfortable with the celebrity, feeling that the attention focuses on them when it should honour the men who didn't come home. The cultural impact of Band of Brothers extends beyond entertainment. It shapes how America remembers World War II. The series humanises the war, showing soldiers as individuals with fears and flaws rather than patriotic stereotypes. It depicts combat with brutal honesty, not glorifying violence but showing its costs. It honours sacrifice without romanticising war. The 101st becomes the lens through which millions of people understand the European theatre, for better or worse. The unit's experiences D-Day, Bastogne, the camps become the archetypal American World War II experience, even though millions of soldiers served in other units and other theatres. The outsized attention creates some resentment among veterans of other divisions who feel their stories are overlooked. But the 101st didn't seek this attention. It arrived unbidden, decades after the war, and they accepted it with the grace of men who'd survived worse things than celebrity. The historical assessment of the 101st's effectiveness generates debate among military historians. Were they genuinely superior to other divisions, or did they simply receive the high-profile missions that generated publicity? The statistics suggest genuine excellence. The division accomplished every major objective assigned, held positions that other units couldn't hold, maintained cohesion under extreme conditions. But they also benefited from being an all-volunteer force, receiving above-average training, and getting priority for equipment and replacements. Other divisions fought just as hard with less recognition. The historical truth is probably that the 101st was both genuinely elite and fortunate in receiving missions that showcased their abilities. They were a superior division that also got opportunities to prove it. Lesser units given the same missions might have failed, but other units given different missions also accomplished remarkable things without receiving equivalent recognition. The 101st legend is earned but not exclusive. They're representative of American soldiers' courage and sacrifice, not unique possessors of those qualities. The legacy debate continues among veterans and historians. What does the 101st story teach us? Some argue it demonstrates that elite units are worth the investment, that specialized training and rigorous selection create capabilities that conventional units can't match. Others argue it proves that ordinary people become extraordinary when circumstances demand it, that the volunteers who formed the 101st weren't inherently special but rose to meet impossible challenges. Both interpretations have truth. The 101st was composed of volunteers who sought elite status, trained harder than regular infantry, and carried themselves with pride that bordered on arrogance. But they also proved that courage and determination matter more than training or equipment, that soldiers who refuse to quit can accomplish missions that seem impossible, that the human spirit is more resilient than anyone realizes until it's tested. The division story is both exceptional and universal, exceptional in its specific accomplishments, universal in demonstrating capabilities that exist in any group of people properly motivated and led. The final D-Day veterans are dying now, in the 2020s, the last survivors of an experience that defined the 20th century. Each death is noted with obituaries and tributes, recognition that we're losing living connections to history. Soon there will be no one left who jumped on D-Day, who fought at Bastogne, who saw the camps. Their stories will exist only in books and films and recordings, mediated through technology rather than direct testimony. This transition from living memory to history is inevitable but melancholic. When the last veteran dies, something irreplaceable is lost: the ability to ask questions, to hear first-hand accounts, to sit with someone who was there and absorb not just facts, but the emotional reality of their experience. The 101st will continue existing as a military unit, carrying the lineage and battle streamers, but the connection to World War II will become increasingly abstract as the generation that created the legend passes away. The Screaming Eagle's rendezvous with destiny, promised by General Lee in August 1942, was kept in ways nobody could have predicted. They jumped into Normandy darkness and helped win D-Day. They held Bastogne against impossible odds and helped win the Battle of the Bulge. They fought across Europe and helped defeat Nazi Germany. They discovered the concentration camps and bore witness to crimes that must never be forgotten. They paid for these accomplishments with 17,500 casualties, nearly 5,000 deaths, and psychological wounds that will never fully heal. But they succeeded. They kept their rendezvous with destiny, and in doing so, they helped shape the world we live in today. The war they fought ended fascism in Europe, established American military power, set the stage for the Cold War, and demonstrated that democracy could field armies capable of defeating totalitarian regimes. The 101st's contribution to that victory was significant but not unique. Millions of soldiers from dozens of nations shared in the accomplishment. But the Screaming Eagle's story captures something essential about that generation's sacrifice, and that's why we remember them, tell their stories, and honour their memory. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things when history demanded it. They were soldiers who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved what they were defending. They were the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and they earned their place in history through courage, sacrifice, and the determination never to surrender. Their legacy will endure as long as we remember that freedom isn't free, that evil must be fought, and that ordinary people contain reserves of courage we only discover when tested. The Screaming Eagles flew into history and never came back down. Their legend lives on. The end.